Kastner sold his soul to the devil. That was the opinion of Judge Binyamin Halevi in the Kastner trial, 1955. I titled the lecture, Kastner, A Source of Pride or a Badge of Silence, You Decide. Today's lecture is sponsored by Rabbi Yaakov and Lisa Traeger. It's Lilui Nishmas Yaakov's father, Asher Ruvain ben Eliezer, who was buried, his kfura is buried on Tisha B'Av, I remember it well, 15 years ago. Their son Ashi proudly carries the name of Rabbi Yaakov's father, and we're very indebted to the Traegers for sponsoring, and we wish him as always a complete refuah shlema. In 1952, a Jew by the name of Michael Greenwald, who was a Hungarian Jew who had lost approximately 52 relatives in the Holocaust, his brother, whose only son was killed in the 1948 War of Independence, defending the old city of Jerusalem, which unfortunately in 1948 fell to the Jordanian Arab Legion, and his son was among those who were killed. He owned a small hotel in the late 1930s after after Austria was annexed to Germany. He was attacked by Austrian Nazis who broke both his legs, both his arms, his nose, his jaw, and they slit his tongue. They left him for dead on a Viennese street. With the help of Hashem, he recovered, but the message was clear, and soon after, he grabbed his wife and his son and his daughter, and thankfully they were able to find refuge in Eretz Yisrael. As I mentioned, his son, by the time he comes to Eretz Yisrael, he's a man close to 60, but his son serves proudly in the IDF and is killed in the line of duty. To make a living, he owned a small hotel near Kikar Tzion in the middle of Jerusalem. And after the death of his son, in honor of his son, since his son was killed on Har Tzion. Har Tzion, you can still, of course, see it today. The Shar there, the gate there, Shar Tzion, was the gate where the Jewish refugees that Erev Shabbos were allowed to be evacuated, except for the men. And since he died there on Har Tzion, he renamed the hotel Hotel Tzion. He himself never was fluent in Hebrew. His mother tongue was Yiddish. He also spoke Hungarian and German. He, besides running a meager hotel which supported himself and his family, his daughter Rena was a nurse, and in the day she worked at Hadassah Hospital helping people, while in the evening, since he already arrived in Israel, in Eretz Yisrael, in pre-state Palestine, she would offer her services for free to wounded Irgun members. As many of you know, of course, in pre-state Palestine, as in post-state Israel, there are many different political parties. Generally, if we divide them up among the labor socialist parties, and the revisionist parties. Now it's a little bit whatever. Likud is the heir to the Cherut, which was the heir to Menachem Begin's Etzel, or Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the Etzel group. He was an Etzelnik, Mr. Greenwald, so was his children. And he began at some point in the 1950s, late 40s, to produce I don't want to say a weekly magazine, because, well, I guess in the digital age it's really not fair to compare, but I can't tell you who reads it because it's just sent out via email, but I have about approximately 3,000 people who, when I send out, who received the short vort. Whether they open it or not is not known. But he put out a pamphlet, a weekly pamphlet called Michtav Lechaverai Bamizrachi, a letter to my friends in the Mizrachi. The Mizrachi was religious Zionists, not to be confused at all, and I don't want to get sidetracked with Israeli politics, but not to be confused with the Messianic religious Zionists, the hilltop people. The old Mizrachi were religious Zionists. However, they were in every single government, almost basically, with the labor Zionists who were known as Mapai. And just to give you a quick idea of the map of things, Mapai, which were the Socialist Workers' Party, that was Ben-Gurion's party, that was the largest party. They controlled Israeli politics from pre-state, the 1930s, until the shocking election of Menachem Begin in April of 1977. The second largest party was Mapam. Mapam was also a leftist socialist Zionist party. However, they were much more closely aligned, not quite, but aligned somewhat with the communists. Mapai and Mapam generally voted together, and Maki, that was the third leftist socialist party, they were outright communists. On the right wing, you had Cherut, which was basically Menachem Begin's party, which were basically made up of revisionist followers of Benjamin Zev Jabotinsky, and the Etzel, the Stern group, those were the followers more of the right-wing groups. And we know familiar, of course, the Haganah and Palmach. The Palmach was sort of the, not exactly, but somewhat the Navy SEALs of the Haganah. They were more representative of the Mapai and Mapam. So Michal Greenwald, he would publish a weekly newsletter called Bichtav Lechaverai Bamizrachi, a letter to my friends in the Mizrachi. The Mizrachi were religious people, Orthodox Jews, but confirmed Zionists, and confirmed Zionists in that they believed in the setting up of the State of Israel. Perhaps in another venue we could discuss the distinction between them and present-day religious Zionist groups, but suffice to today that they were not messianic. They were pragmatic Zionists, and I mean, they believed that it would be good to have a Jewish state and Orthodox Jews should support them. And he was an Orthodox Jew from Hungary. He didn't know Hebrew. So he would write his pamphlet either in Yiddish, Hungarian, or German, I don't know which one. And then his daughter, Rina, or someone else, would translate it into Hebrew. He then would go to the local equivalent of Kinko's in Israel, in Jerusalem, which whatever, I don't know what that was. And he would mimeograph, I guess with the old carbon paper, he would mimeograph approximately 1,000 copies, not more, and he would send them to his friends in the Mizrahi. And Mizrahi, by the way, was compared to Mapai, Mapam, and even Cherut, was a smaller party. Out of the 1,000 people who received this weekly mailing, I would not imagine, if he got 50% readership, I would imagine he was happy. He wrote in 1952, I'm going to just read the Hebrew, Reach shel peger migared necharai, the stench of a corpse is scratching my nostrils. Tiyezu halvaya mishufra de shufra. You see, he was somewhat of a learned man as he references Aramaic, Talmudic Aramaic. This will be the funeral, the greatest, beautiful funeral ever. Whose funeral will be so beautiful? As Dr. Kastner, Tzarich L'chasel. What we have to get rid of. Now, L'chasel literally means, Chisul means to get rid of. To get, I don't know, get a, what?
Eliminate.
Eliminate, thank you. Eliminate, good word, eliminate. It's obviously also not such a code word, and it can also mean to assassinate easily. In fact, those of you who read the paper, read the Israeli paper as I do, on Friday it was announced that Tzahal Chisel at the Rosh HaGavshal, whatever, that the IDF was Mechasel, they eliminated the head of the northern region of Islamic Jihad, and hopefully I think they did the southern the next day as well. But anyway, he wrote Dr. Kastner has to be eliminated. Certainly not the nicest thing to say. Why should Dr. Kastner be eliminated? Lahavir ladin, in order to bring him to judgment. Uleshpoch as bizayon hadiyun al harodef karira zeh, because we have to pour the disgrace on this career, this person who just is a career man. He runs after the career, meaning he runs after just the kavod. Hanene memase hashod varetzach shel Hitler. Whoa, these are huge allegations. This person is a beneficiary of the robberies, the shod, the stealings, the booty of Hitler, Yamach Shmo, and of the murder that Hitler committed as well. Why? Al yisod tachbulotav hapliliot, because he had all these criminal strategies. He's a criminal. Ubiglal, not only is he a criminal, Biglal shituf ha'pu'ula im hanatzim, because of his collaboration with the Nazis, ani ro'eh oto kirotzeach va'akifin shel achai hayikarim. I look at him as a murderer, va'akifin, meaning an indirect murderer of my brothers. That's what Mr. Greenwald, Malkiel Greenwald, published in 1952. Now, if you had your morning edition of the New York Times on Saturday, March 16th, 1957, so if you happen not to have it with you, I have a copy right now. You can get it. If you want it, you can get it. I have a copy of the original Times in 1957 from March 16th. This was actually sent to somebody, Eastwood, 222 Surlis Avenue, Benton Harbor, Michigan. I don't know when he got it, but it's from March 16, 1957. By the way, the front page story is Cairo decides to continue Suez ban on Israeli ships. Mrs. Mayer is flying to the U.S. Israel is tense. And this was obviously a reference, of course, that in 1956, you're many aware, there was a war where Israel captured the Sinai Desert and eventually was forced to give it back. If you look on page 3 of that Saturday's paper, so on page 3, the following piece appeared. Israeli Quisling, dead of wounds. Dr. Kastner, branded a Nazi collaborator, succumbs to assassins' bullets. Tel Aviv, Israel, March 15th. Dr. Rudolf Kastner, controversial Hungarian Jewish leader in World War II, died today of an assassin's bullets. Dr. Kastner was found bleeding profusely from 3 chest wounds in a northern Tel Aviv street early on March 4th. He was taken to the hospital, but his condition grew progressively worse. Mrs. Kastner was at her husband's bedside when he died. A number of persons were rounded up following the shooting. The police said 2 young men among those detained would be charged with murder. The slain man had been editor of the Hungarian language newspaper Huge Kelet in Tel Aviv and was believed returning home when attacked. An abandoned jeep was found near the spot where he was cut down. Dr. Kastner headed a Budapest rescue committee of Hungarian Jews during the Nazi occupation of Hungary in 1944. After the war, he was accused of being a stooge for the Nazis. In June 1955, a Jerusalem district court ruled that Dr. Kastner had acted as a quisling. It said he had known that by his actions he was sacrificing a large number of Jews to save a small group of his friends and relatives. The court's decision came after a year-long libel trial of Malkiel Greenwald, who had charged that Dr. Kastner had collaborated with the Nazis and had prepared the ground for the mass murder of Hungarian Jews. Mr. Greenwald was exonerated on libel, and Dr. Kastner maintained his innocence. And then it just goes, long article, it goes on to say that Dr. Kastner had been a rising leader in Israel's dominant Mapai party. Mr. Greenwald published a pamphlet charging that Dr. Kastner had been a collaborator with the Nazis in the massacre of 500,000 Hungarian Jews. He asserted that the rescue committee Dr. Kastner headed had negotiated an agreement under which 600 Jews, including 19 members of his own family, were permitted to escape. In return for that, he charged Dr. Kastner worked against the revolt against the Nazis. Mapai leaders lodged a charge of criminal libel against Mr. Greenwald. Dr. Kastner admitted dealing with the Nazis, saying he was simply doing all he could to save his people. What's interesting was that the Times, at the time, called him, without any caveat, a quisling. We're familiar that Mr. Quisling was the premier of Norway during World War II, who outright collaborated with the Nazis, I believe he was sentenced to death after, well, what? He was executed, correct? Mr. Quisling was eventually executed. Thank you, Aaron, for his collaboration with the Nazis. And as we see that from the pamphlet in the early 1950s till 1957, it seems that Mr. Greenwald charges were vindicated, as even the New York Times calls him a quisling or a collaborator. The Kastner affair, I don't know how well it's known to most people in the room. My hunch tells me not that. I'm sure many of you do, but I'm sure many of you don't. You should know that in Israel today it's still, well, not large, but it's still somewhat of a hot-button issue. However, up until 1961 of the Eisenman trial, it was certainly the most famous Holocaust and libel case ever adjudicated in the state of Israel. There are literally dozens of books written, both in Hebrew and English, speaking about the case, and still to be written nowadays. There are dozens of academic articles in various journals, and to this day, the passionate debate continues as to Mr. Kastner. But before I get to the story, I want to answer a question. And that is, why are we speaking about the Kastner case today? I mentioned in the past that Tisha B'Av is a very, very difficult day for a person, a regular person, to relate to. When we come to Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, it's very easy to relate to those days. You're in shul a good part of the day. The theme of the day is quite clear. HaMelech HaMishpat, it's a day of judgment. You have 10 days of repentance, of tshuva, climaxing in Yom Kippur, which obviously is our final appeal. One can sense the tension and hopefully the anticipation of vindication on a Yom Kippur. And being in shul the whole day with the tefillos and with the knowledge that your sins, bread, they'll be kashela galbinu, they'll be white. All that leads to a fairly easy way to approach the day. The other days as well, the Shalosh Regalim, you have your sukkah to sit into, the beautiful davening, you have matzah to eat on Pesach. On Shavuos, we have learning Torah. And all these days, honestly, also very much revolve around the family. What's Yontif without the family and guests? Festive meals. And it's not just that Jews always like to eat. Eating in all, frankly, all cultures is a way of bringing people together and a way of fraternizing, socializing, bonding. Tisha B'Av is a very difficult day. What's the point of Tisha B'Av? What are you supposed to feel? What are you supposed to take away with on Tisha B'Av? For this reason, for the difficulty involved, so therefore at one point, historically, early on, the great poets of Hebrew liturgy, most notably Rabbi Eliezer Kalir, authored a great many piyutim, or as we call them, kinos, poems, liturgical poems, to try to fill the gap, to try through these liturgical poems to try to create a sense of what Chazal wanted you to feel today. There's no doubt on hearing Megillus Eicha, studying the kinos, that there's one emotion, one feeling Chazal wanted you to have on a day like today. And that is the word mourning. To be sad and be mournful. There's no doubt about it. In fact, you're not even allowed to say hello. When I walked in now, I saw some people I haven't seen for a while. How do I greet them? Do I smile? Do we just look away from each other? It's the most antisocial day on the Jewish calendar. Can't invite you in for a drink, bite to eat. I can't even say hello to you. Not only that, even those things that Chazal recommended. Some have a practice of visiting a cemetery on Tisha B'Av. Even that, the poskim advise, don't go in a group. Don't make it a group trip. Go yourself, maybe one other person. It should be a day of solitary confinement. It's a day of sadness. It's a day of mourning. If we understood the keynotes, we would read them, we would understand that descriptions of women consuming their own children, of mothers executing their own children, of fathers pulling children out from under the bed to slaughter them with their own hands, to save them from baptism from the Catholic Church, of brides swooning after being brutally murdered and violated by Roman soldiers, Babylonian soldiers, Catholics. It's a day of sadness. Interestingly enough, somebody wrote to me, why are you speaking about a topic which obviously a Jewish collaborator, a Jew who was assassinated by a Jew, on a day which is dedicated to Ahavas Yisrael? Obviously, I respected the person, and they wrote respectfully, and certainly I never really feel, I've learned this the hard way, but I never really feel that engaging in email dispute is a proper method of ever trying to solve any sort of disagreement with anyone. But it's not a day of Ahavas Yisrael. We're not against Ahavas Yisrael today, don't get me wrong. We're not a day that we advocate for Stennis Yisrael. But there's nowhere in the halacha where it says, be nice to your friend today. Make sure on Tisha B'Av chayev adam lenashek et chavero. It's chayev to kiss your friend, or give them a challah, or, I don't know, invite them for Shabbos. That's not going on today. Not going on. Even charity to the poor, you can give it, but it's not one of the themes of the day. The only theme of the day is to be sad, be sweaty, be hungry, feel, I don't know what the word is, not showered for longer than you'd want to be, and to be sad. The mitzvah of the day is to be sad. And that's what Chazal attempted to foster, that feeling of sadness, through obviously the reading of Eicha and the recitation of Kinos. Now obviously the problem is that, as I've mentioned earlier, but I'll briefly mention again, that the Kinos for the most part don't speak to us. And even if one has, which there are, thank God, very, very excellent English translations of the Kinos, nevertheless, the liturgical tefillah aspect of the recitation of Kinos, for most people anyway, is difficult in English, probably even more difficult in the original Hebrew. Well, we're left in a quandary. How do you feel sad for a whole day? So we know that many organizations, nothing wrong with it, but have decided to abscond with the day, to use it, why not, as a day to look at the remedy of the cause of the sadness. If the sadness, the primary cause of the sadness, is the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, and Chazal tell us that the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash was brought about through sinas chinam, through baseless hatred, and as the Chafetz Chaim elaborates, that he feels that the greatest form of baseless hatred is lashon hara, speaking rechilas, lashon hara. So obviously, it would be a good day to work on the tikkun, to work on the corrective means, and to achieve Ahavas chinam, to rebuild, which it is, nothing wrong. But nevertheless, still, that's not the point of the day. We don't find anywhere in halacha where you're permitted to study the laws of lashon hara. You're not permitted to study Torah today. Inclusive in the laws of studying Torah is ostensibly the laws of lashon hara. If you have a question, perhaps you can look up that specific issue. And I think we all understand that this difficulty, and there's nothing wrong with it, it's a beautiful thing. But truth be told, Chazal, I hoped, I imagined through the recitation of Kinos, one would be in a state of sadness throughout the day, which is obviously a challenging, it's a daunting proposition, a challenging idea. So therefore, in the past, which Be'ez Hashem will do today, we'll discuss a sad incident, which will hopefully make us sad. But hopefully, we'll also extrapolate lessons from the sad incident that hopefully we can incorporate into our lives. I remind you that the Rambam writes in Hilchas Tainus, certainly an appropriate text to learn today on the Tainus, that it's a mitzvah aseh min haTorah, it's a positive mitzvah, la'ariah b'chatzotros, to sound the trumpets when bad things happen to the Jewish people. And when you have a tzara, when you have a bad thing which occur, you should awaken the people to do tshuva. Why? V'zehu sheyigrom lahem la'asir hatzara me'alehem. Because people have to know, v'yedu, people have to know, shebeglal ma'aseyem hara'im hora lahem. Because of their deeds, their evil deeds, this evil has come upon them. And therefore, if they correct their ways, the evil will go away. Meaning, one of the basic beliefs in Judaism is, notwithstanding we have free choice, certainly as elaborated upon by the Rambam in his 13 Principles of Faith, is that notwithstanding our belief in the God's being omniscient, of knowing all, inclusive of the past, the present, and the future, nevertheless, that doesn't preclude, not just doesn't preclude, it's outright heresy to deny the fact that both ideas, namely of God's omniscience and man's free will, coexist, irrespective of the fact that at first glance they may seem logically mutually exclusive. We believe that our actions in this world count, and we are held accountable for their actions, but not just that they count, in the fact of our own personal actions, but rather they count in what's going to be happening in the world. Meaning, if there is a lot of sinas chinam, if there's a lot of baseless hatred going on in the world, so that triggers those actions from us triggers reactions from Hashem. And those reactions from Hashem is the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So obviously it behooves us, when there are tsaros, when bad things are happening, when rockets are being fired from Gaza, when there are shuls, 11 Jews are killed in cold blood in Squirrel Hill and near Pittsburgh. We have to know, yes, we have to take preventative measures practically, but we also have to know ultimately that our actions, namely spiritual actions, impact on what happens to the Jewish people. And if you don't believe that, im lo yizaku v'lo yariu, if you don't call out to Hashem and you don't react, Ela Yomru, you say that the bad thing happening is miminhag ha'olam. That's just the way things are. Just the way things happen. People get into fight. Ukrainians fight Russians. Taiwanians fight Chinese. Palestinians fight Israelis. That's just the minhag ha'olam, the way of the world. V'tzarazu nikra nikris, it happens. You know what the Rambam says if you say that? Harei zu derech achzarius. You're a cruel person. You're a cruel person if you believe that things just happen. V'goremes lahem lidabek b'maaseim haraim v'tosif hatzara tzaros acheres. It causes people to cling to their bad actions, and more chas v'shalom tzaros can happen again, and even in a more intense degree. U'medivrei sofrim lehisanos al kol tzara shetavo al hatzibur. And another thing is to fast. And by fasting, hopefully, we have a feeling, we feel our mortality, we are humbled, and hopefully that will cause us to change our ways when we recognize the fact that the troubles which are occurring to us have to do with our insufficient or deficient fulfillment of mitzvos. So when we improve and we get back on par, then ad shirachmu min hashamayim, in the heavens they should have mercy on us, and Be'ezus Hashem will hear our tefillos and things will change. And therefore I contend that by learning about events of history, sad events of history, if we choose to ignore the sad events of history, so to be cliche-ish, those who don't learn from history are destined to repeat them or suffer again from them, so too by us as well. And this is a story of enough sinas chinam to go around that there's what to learn from. Some of you may ask, which is another email I received, what right do I or anybody else have to judge any event which occurred during the Holocaust? The horrors of the horrors. The nightmare of the nightmares. What right do we have to even think we have the ability to judge those who entered into the kingdom of hell? And that's a good question. That question was raised in 1955. Again, after Mr. Kastner went on trial. Well, he didn't go on trial, we'll get to that. But as the trial was going on, two opinions. Yesh ha'omrim ein lanu zchut lishpot et hanashim ha'elu. There are those that say we have no right to judge anyone. Sheker v'chazov, that's an outright lie. Muchrachim lishpot, we are obligated to judge the actions of others. Ein monopol anashim shayusham, there's no monopoly on judging the events exclusively to those who lived through them. Yesh lilmod et hatkufa. You have to learn about that historical period. V'chovat ha'am lishpot gam bogdim v'gam lochamim. And it's an obligatory on the people to judge those who are deemed to be traitors and collaborators and those who are deemed to be heroes. Ha'am chayav lishpot mishpat tzedek. We have an obligation to the future generations to judge in a just fashion. Tzarich lilmon hashkiot. We have to learn from mistakes of the past. Miyodea b'fnei yelu parshios drokim omed am. Who knows what lays ahead? What other crossroads and decisions lay ahead of us that we perhaps would learn from the past? Sounds like something perhaps you can quote from a Rosh Yeshiva. In truth, it's quoted by Yitzchok Zuckerman, who was head of the Kibbutz HaMeuchad. He was one of the heads of the Kibbutz movement in 1955. On the other hand, Ein ani savur she'inyan zeh hitnahagut Yehudim b'artzot hatofet v'Nazi. I don't think that the behavior of Jews during the Nazi Holocaust, hu inyan lebeirur mishpati, it's open to judgment. Rather, ledati laniach lemishpat hahistoria bedor yavo. I leave it to historians in the future, let them decide. And he writes, HaYehudim al yichu al atzmam lishpot et acheihem. We shouldn't judge our brothers who were there. B'nei doreinu shelo tamu tam gehenim zeh. And our generation who thankfully did not experience the Holocaust, mutav lahem, it seems to be, lefi aniyas daiti, in my humble opinion, ladum, to be silent. Bi'aganu ba'anofa, and humbly and in sadness. Those words were uttered by no one less than Mr. David Ben-Gurion, Prime Minister of the State of Israel, of his opposition to the entire Kastner affair. So let's begin from the beginning of who is what and where we got. Rudolf Kastner is born in 1906 to an Orthodox Jewish family in Kloisenberg. He's a Kloisenberger, not a Chassid, but he was born in Kloisenberg. Kloisenberg had approximately 20,000 Jews at the time. By the way, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, who lived a few miles from here much of his life in Union City, then moved to Netanya, he was already the Kloisenberger Rov. In Kloisenberg, he was the Rebbe already at that time. He was not on the Kastner train, which we'll talk about. He lost his wife and 11 children. But he was born in Kloisenberg. Yisrael Kastner, he was known in German as Rudolf, in Hungarian as Rezo, and in Israel he was known as Yisrael. He was born 1906. He was shot March 4th, 1957. He dies March 15th, 1957, and he's buried on Purim Day. I don't know if it was that. I think the next day was Purim. That's when he was buried. Who was he? Well, one thing about him we know, he certainly felt, that's for sure, that he was, hard to tell who he was. One thing for sure he wasn't a modest man, that's for sure. We're not talking about a man who was humble or modest. Nobody believes that. Even a book which I found to be quite not very, helpful to the world, but I didn't think it was a good book. but it's probably the most free English book, called Kastner's Train by Anna Porter. I think she published in 2007. Her subtitle is The True Story of an Unknown Hero of the Holocaust. Let's go back 1 minute. Full disclosure. There's a very good chance, very good chance that I would not be here if it wasn't for the Kastner train. Some of you may not know yet what that is, but that was the train which is called the Kastner train, which brought a number of Jews that were saved from the Holocaust. My wife was sitting in the first row. Her grandmother and her grandfather, and some aunts and uncles too. They were on the Kastner train. So it's very possible that I never would have met my wife, and who knows if I would have been here. So I certainly have personal skin in the game vested in the story. Notwithstanding that full disclosure, I found this book very lacking intellectually, lacking academically, lacking in truth. And even though Ms. Porter subtitles her book, The True Story of an Unknown Hero of the Holocaust, her next book, some of you may not like this, so it's okay. A lot of things I say people don't like. I'm used to it. But her next book is a biography on George Soros and what a great tzaddik he is, and how he's helping to reshape American democracy by supporting every district attorney and prosecutor who agrees not to prosecute any crime in the world. So, well, I'm exaggerating, but you can look him up if you want. He was also born in Budapest, Mr. Soros, a multi-billionaire. Again, read the book, judge you want. Anyway, what's interesting about this book, which is titled, I just want to tell you, The True Story of an Unknown Hero of the Holocaust, I have to admit, I didn't expect it to be hagiographic. I didn't expect it to be an art scroll book. I didn't expect that. I didn't expect every page to say what a tzaddik, how he helped every orphan in the world, that he was available 24/7. And I didn't think that. But I have to admit, for a book that she calls The Story of the Unknown Hero of the Holocaust, I read the book twice. There's not one nice anecdote about him in the book. Now, I have to tell you that normally I put about 30 to 40 hours of preparation into one of these talks. This year we're closer to 70 to 80. The more I read, the more I found. That's one of the reasons that don't be scared off. Some people already have left. It's okay. That's why we started at 4. Usually I start at 5. But I have to admit, like, I don't know. She has, like, I wrote every time. She's very, like, there's like not one story of like the guy finding some, poor lady and bringing her into the house and giving him his last morsel of bread that he had in the Holocaust. There's not one story of him, finding a stray cat and giving it milk or nothing. Like, there's not one anecdotal incident in a book which spans, almost 500 pages. Also interesting that, by the way, I always find this when I finish my autobiography. She has an interesting, I don't know what is it called, interesting thing. She writes, a note to the reader. This is a work of popular history. I have done my best to be accurate, but I allowed myself leeway to reconstruct scenes and dialogue based on diaries, topes, interviews, blah, blah, blah. And then she writes, I've done my best to cross-reference. It is possible that some of my judgments or reconstructions are mistaken, of course. but I do not consider anything in this book to be simply speculative. The whole book is speculative. I mean, she writes what people wore. Everybody she talks about, she never met in her life. She's my age. I don't want to tell you how old I am. But believe me, in 1957, I wasn't old enough to give interviews. I mean, that's I can tell you for sure. Everybody in the book is dead before she started writing. I mean, so I don't know how she knows what they read, what they thought, what they breathed, what they ate. I mean, it seems to me the whole book is speculative. But anyway, let's leave Miss Porter alone for a while. Anyway, for instance, let's just give one example, already on page 15, just to give you a little feeling of the book. So first of all, Kastner marries the daughter of Joseph Fisher. Joseph Fisher is the richest man in town. He probably also has the prettiest daughter in town. By the way, as an aside, again, I always say, never believe what I say, just check it out. But if you want, I wasted it, you could do it too. You could listen for 2 hours to her lecture at the museum in New York that doesn't allow the governor from Florida to speak, the Jewish of Tolerance Museum that doesn't allow senators from Florida to speak, that one. So anyway, but that Museum of Tolerance, except for Floridian senators, governors, so she gets a drasha there, you can hear it on YouTube, and she writes that actually that she was so interested in this book, she really wanted to make it a love story. Just to give you a quick, Rezo Kastner is the main character of the book, but his was supposed to be his buddy, his partner was a man named Joel Brand. Joel Brand, which we'll see in a second, gets sent to Istanbul early in the book. Very quickly, right away, Mr. Kastner, who's married, very quickly makes sure that Mrs. Brand is no longer lonely, and that continues till he gets killed. Till he gets killed, he doesn't observe the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom. He does not observe the cherem of Rabbeinu Gershom of limiting oneself to one wife. He does not. Anyway, so he marries this woman who's 10 years younger than him, and she writes, this is what she's writing, not me, this is what she writes. Fisher, that's his shver, Fisher, his father-in-law. Fisher may have been the only other person in the world whose intelligence the young man respected. That's a funny thing to say. Kastner dismissed people as stupid, incompetent, or intellectually cowardly. He was intolerant of his critics. He had no sense of other people's sensitivities, nor did he ever care whether he alienated his friends. This is the unknown hero. Okay, whatever. In local government, Kastner was remembered as a fixer. The man who everybody knew to who to give the money to fix their problems. And so on and so forth. Truthfully, I could go on that, like I said, it's kind of amazing to me. And frankly, I couldn't find in any book that I read, and I read a lot, even those who say he did do good things, who say he was a nice guy. Like the only thing everybody agrees upon is that he was an arrogant, you fill in the rest. Everybody agrees that. He was an arrogant, haughty person who couldn't care about anybody else or what they, except for Eisenman. Eisenman he cared about, but we'll get there. By the end of 1940, most Jewish men in Hungary were in labor battalions. And the young men of Kloisenberg were swiftly called up to join them. Kastner himself was called up. However, he managed to negotiate a special dispensation for medical reasons. So there's a lot of telltale signs already at the beginning that Mr. Kastner is a manipulator or a fixer or whatever you want to call him. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Mr. Kastner is certainly a bright man. Notwithstanding the fact that his father was very frum, there's pictures of his father, a very frum man with a beard, yarmulke, properly frum a man, would have fit to say a good. Apparently his mother, again, I don't know what Kloisenberg looked like in 1910, when he was born in 1906, but his mother apparently wasn't so frum, and apparently she wore the pants in the house, because she sent him to Goyish school. She sent him to secular school, not to Jewish school. And in fact, it doesn't seem like he went much to Jewish school. And there, I guess it was, now he lived in Kloisenberg. Kloisenberg, by the way, sometimes you woke up on Tuesday and you found out that you had to sing the Romanian national anthem. And then when you woke up the next day, Wednesday, you were told to sing the Hungarian national anthem. And sometimes you woke up on Thursday and you were told to sing the Slovakian national anthem, and then Friday maybe the Czech national anthem. Meaning it happened up until 1919, it was part of the great Austro-Hungarian Empire. However, those of you who know, in 1919, Hungary was aligned with Germany, the axes, the wrong side, in World War I. And when they made the Treaty of Versailles, so we know that Britain and France were dead set on punishing big-time Germany. Big time, let's punish Germany. And Wilson from America said, no, let's not do that, it's not a good idea. Unfortunately, Wilson got COVID, or what they called back then the Spanish flu. And unfortunately, whatever it went, he got COVID in the head a little. That's what they think. Anyway, one day he came to the Versailles thing and said, you know what, so sign whatever you want, and France and Britain got their way. And part of this whole thing was that Hungary was also punished. And they sliced off the whole northeastern chunk of Hungary, and they gave it to Romania. Romania, you get this, Hungary. And Hungary was a big, nice, big geschmacka country, became a little country. And that's where he grew up, in Kloisenberg, when it was part of Romania. 50% of the people there were still Hungarians. So he knew like 7 languages, truthfully. He was a bright man. By the way, the reason he's called Dr. Kastner is that back then, if you got a JD, you were allowed to be called doctor. You know, like nowadays, you get a PhD, you get to be called doctor, even though you're not a doctor. You know, I wouldn't go to you for a headache, but you get to be called doctor. Why is that? But dentists get to be called doctors, but JDs don't get to be called doctors. But there, apparently, you got to be called doctor if you got a law degree, which he did. And he was a very bright man, and he was living in Kloisenberg. Now, what happens in 1940? In 1940, Hitler, who takes over Germany, 33. So we know that there was the Anschluss in the late 30s where Hitler said, hey, I'm taking Austria. That was good, right? And then, and we know he took also a whole big slice of Czechoslovakia as well. And then in 1940, Hungary joined Hitler. So as a prize for joining Hitler, they sliced back that chunk of northeastern Transylvania, Romania. Transylvania hardly ever existed as its own country. But they sliced off that part, Transylvania, Romania, and they gave it back to Hungary. So starting in 1940, Kloisenberg was back in Hungary. Anyway, he's there, and the war starts, and Hungary is with Hitler, a bad choice, and in but they're not really doing much. Hungary doesn't, the more I read about Hungary, the more I realized it's a place that I hope, with God's help, I'll never step foot on in my whole life till I die, Bezship. Certainly not a place I would ever want to even pass over. A very not nice place. Not also an intelligent place either, frankly. But they weren't too much of a help for Hitler. Their army wasn't too efficient. They were good in killing Jews. That they liked. They liked a lot killing Jews. Always liked killing Jews. They had these people, the Arrow Cross. These were like these vicious animals dressed up as people who would go ahead and kill Jews all the time. Like in the early 1940s too, they would kill Jews before anything. Anyway, he's living there, and he realizes as the war starts that there's nothing really doing in Klausenberg, so he decides to move to the capital, Budapest. By the way, Budapest, you should know, only becomes Budapest, of course, in 1927. Before 1927, there are three different cities, because the Danube River goes between Budapest. There are three cities. There's Buda, Pest, and Odva, or Oda. Od is the oldest, that means old, Odva. In fact, in Yiddish, it's called the Alta Buda, or Odba. That was the old city. And one is on the east of the Danube, two are on the west of the Danube, and the three cities combined to call the place Budapest in 1927, and it became Budapest. That became the main capital, three big cities, and that's where he moves to. And he moves there, frankly, without like any official thing. He's a Zionist, which again, I'm not 100% sure what exactly that means. It says also he made sure that, she writes in the book, that he wasn't the Hopa Hey, putting on the Kova Temple, digging ditches, let's go to Israel type of person. He seems to be more the behind the scenes, how much money we can get type of person. Again, this is just from her mostly. Anyway, he moves to Budapest and he meets all the Jewish leaders. And every single one, without boring you with each quotes of each one, but every Jewish leader he meets. And one thing, unfortunately, is sad, and this I have to admit is sad. This is sad, is that that there was, unfortunately, among all the organizations, all the Jewish organizations, if there was one thing which existed, was totally disunity. What I mean, this all the books pointed to that, by the way. In the Orthodox, there was disunity between the modern Orthodox and the more like, ultra-Orthodox. And then there was this community called the Neolog, and they were sort of like Reform Jews, and they didn't like anybody either. And then the Zionists, they had like 5 or 4 different Zionist groups, and they all hated each other too. It was Shomer HaTzair, Mapai, Mapam, all these organizations, and she writes honestly that they all worked independently, which certainly didn't help things, certainly later on, and they all worked independently, and they all disliked each other. The dislike was mutual. Kastner despised Kraus. Kraus was the head of the Mizrahi group as a functionary, and then on the other hand, Kraus didn't like him. Says until recently, he had been reasonably comfortable, this is talking about Kraus, in rewarding those he agreed with and denying those he disliked. Kastner was going to be in the second category. By the way, just as far as Kraus for a moment, in almost every book you'll read, Kraus is considered a tzaddik. Kraus, who was head of the Mizrahi in Budapest, is considered, he was the person that any certificates, the few and far between certificates that the British offered anyone to get into Palestine, which was few and far between, he distributed them very, very fairly to Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, Neologs, Shomer HaTzair, and all the books I read, they attribute to him to be a very, very special person. A lot of anecdotal evidence of him going out of his way to get people's certificates, with the exception of Ann Porter's book. She's convinced he's a bad man. Anyway, I was able to obtain an actual letter, which is the actual letter signed by him, by Moshe Kraus. It's from the Histadrut HaMizrahi Behungaria, the Hungarian, where he actually writes to Harav HaGoyen Moreno Rav Yosef Nimnin, Av Bezdin Dekilas Kodesh Ovda Shlita. Now, Ovda is that third city, the Budapest, and Oved. So he was the Rav of Oved, which was an old shul. By the way, like 1912, the Hungarians decided to be a shtickle, I don't know, nice is the word, but they gave back the shul and a Chabad guy got it. It still functions, I think. The Chabad guy now, he runs the shul there. But he used to have a big Jewish community, and this Rav Nimnan, was a big Talmid Chacham. He was the Rav of the Udva, and Rabbi Mr. Krauss, Moshe Krauss, he writes him that we're so happy that a Chashav Rav is part of us. Anu margishim lo chova lahachzik lo tova labia toda beruba. We want to thank you. We thank you on your didus, and you're helping us to do what? Be'ad artzeinu, be'ad toraseinu. On account of helping Eretz Yisrael and Torah. And therefore, and anu betuchim, and we're sure that kvodo will be, that you'll be a very gorem chashuv lagdalat hagbarat toraseinu v'yahadut hacharedit l'chol shtachea, and you will help with all Haredi, who doesn't use the word Haredi as we use it, he meant Orthodox, but all Orthodox Jews in Eretz Yisrael and in Budapest, and he writes him a very beautiful letter. Anyway, he didn't like, Kastner didn't like Krauss. Kastner didn't like anybody, except Kastner. Again, not me, that everybody agrees upon. He didn't work with anybody. The only person he worked well with was Joel Brand's wife. That was the only person he worked well with. Besides that, did not work well with anybody. Anyway, he goes from one organization to another, and nobody wants him. He doesn't work with Mizrahi well. He goes to the official Jewish organization, the Jewish Council of Budapest. He doesn't work well there. And I mean, basically because he wants to be the kingpin. So finally, he sets up his own sort of organization called the Vad Hatzalah. There's no real official organization. Like some books write that he was the official Zionist organization. That's not really true. He was a Zionist, a secular Zionist, but it's not like, and he did eventually have contact with the Zionist organization in Israel. That is true too. But this Vad Hatzalah that he worked for was sort of like, I mean, in English, in Hebrew, it's called the Vad Ezra Hatzalah, or they used to just call them the Va'adah. And in English, it's called the Aid and Rescue Committee. But it was really an organization that he got together with this guy, Joel Brand, and they got together and they made this organization. At the beginning, they did good stuff. In all honesty, they did give stuff. Because remember, since Hungary was on the side of Hitler, so when the war starts in 1939, from 1939 to 1944, Hungary is not in the war. I mean, nothing's going on in Hungary because Hungary is part of Hitler land anywhere. It wasn't like Poland, where Hitler invaded Poland and said, oh, we need Lebensraum, we need a place to live, so we better kill all the Jews. Hungary was their buddy. So Hitler actually suggested to Horthy was the regent of Hungary, he suggested to many times, hey, let's kill a bunch of Jews, why not? But Horthy, he did a little bit, but he wasn't big on the whole thing, the Yellow Star. He didn't go into the ghettoization. He didn't want to get into, Horthy liked, because the Jews were good for the economy, and they minded their own business. Also, by the way, you should know, shockingly, about 20%, Hitler never cared, by the way, but about 20% of Budapest Jews were baptized. That didn't bother Hitler. But Lamaisa, about 20% were baptized. So there was a lot of assimilation going on in the community as well. Anyway, but until 1944, what did he deal with? So I'll tell you what he dealt with. He dealt with Jews who were escaping from Slovakia, which was enemy territory where the Nazis were deporting Jews to Auschwitz and Treblinka, and Jews from Poland that managed. Everybody thought that Budapest, since it was Hitler's ally, and so far they had refused any mass deportations, they thought that that would be the one place that was basically safe. And therefore a lot of Jews, and that was, by the way, also like one of the southern points on the continent that they could get to. Italy, remember, was an ally with Hitler too. So anyway, they would try to get to Budapest, and he would help people there. He did. He'd help people, it seems anyway, get fake IDs, Christian IDs, fake papers, stuff like that. And whatever he did, fine. Anyway, the action really gets going in 1944. That's when the action gets going in 1944. Now, first of all, we have to state emphatically that there's no misunderstanding. Is that more than anything else in the world, all Nazis, especially Hitler, especially Eichmann, those two are like 1 and 2. But all Nazis, the greatest mitzvah in the world they had was to kill a Jew. That was the greatest mitzvah in the world they had, was to kill a Jew. That was hakol bakol. More importantly than winning the war was killing a Jew. That there is no doubt. And killing a Jew in the most vicious, brutal, torturous way was considered a Hiddur mitzvah. By 1944, you had to be deaf, blind, and dumb not to know that the war was over. After the Battle of Stalingrad, and after it, but by the way, Hungary was forced to participate in that battle, and they lost over 150,000 men. They weren't good fighters. But once Hitler, Yimach Shmoy V'Zichro, once the Battle of Stalingrad was lost, and Stalin, Joe Stalin, realized he was betrayed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, there was no stopping Stalin. I mean, truth be known, even though he was no friend of the Yidden, he did more to end the war than all the Allies combined. It's not something we like saying in the Western world, but the reality was that the Eastern Front, because there was nobody who was more vicious and more bent on ripping Germany to shreds than Joseph Stalin and the Russians. Because what the Germans did to the Russians before Stalingrad, they had a lot of revenge on their hands. Anyways, Joe Stalin was moving quickly up, quickly going from east westward. He was at the border of Hungary already. But by January 1944, Joe Stalin is knocking at the door. And there's no stopping him. The Germans, thank God, are outmanned, outgunned. Their motivations have been decreased, depleted. Remember, there was a June 1944, the Germans themselves tried to kill Hitler. So they were in a bad state. So Horthy, who was the regent of Hungary, in March of 1944, he saw the writing on the wall. He sent out feelers to the West. Now, you have to realize, one thing about the Russians is that something like, if you could find a Russian POW from a German that was captured by the German who's alive, you can sell him a lot on eBay. Very, very few Russians came out, very few Germans came out alive. There were no Germans hardly taking POWs by the Russians, because there was the other way too. So the Russians were bent on destroying every person who was against them, which included Hungary. Hungary fought with Hitler in the battle for Stalingrad. So Horthy was no idiot. So Horthy said, let's make shalom. Let's make shalom. Forget it already. Let's make shalom. And this is March of 44. Remember, June 6, 1944, the Allies land at Normandy. And then already the game's over. But already in 1944, the Allies have already captured Italy. Sicily's been captured by then. The Allies are moving up the coast, and they're just about to land at Normandy. In a matter of time, Hitler, Yimach Shmoy V'Zichro, is going to have 3 simultaneous fronts. The Eastern Front, the Western Front, the Southern Front. Remember, his man in Egypt over there, What's his name again? Rommel's gone. Rommel's gone. So the reality is that, the war's over, so Horthy said, let's make friends. Hitler, who was crazy, and his people were crazy, but they were unbelievably obedient to him. On March 15th, he calls Horthy to Berlin and tells him he's got to speak to him about something. And while he's speaking to him, he says, oh, by the way, when you get back to Budapest, my army is going to be there. I'm taking over your country. And you're going to be my puppet, or you'll be dead. So Horthy figured he wanted to live. So Horthy becomes his puppet, and on March 17th, 1944, German tanks roll into Budapest. They take over Hungary. And unfortunately for us, among them, and the main person is nobody less than Adolf Eichmann, Yamach Shmoy V'Zikro, who's second only to Hitler in his vicious, literally visceral hatred of Jews. And Adolf Eichmann comes to Budapest with not more than 200 SS men. Between 150 and 200 Sonderkommando SS men does he bring with him. In fact, he came with so small a force, that's all they could afford at that point, was that when they marched into Budapest, they quickly had the first 100 run around the corner and join again from the back in order that the people in Budapest, oh my God, look, there's an endless amount of SS men coming in. But all he really had was 150, 200 tops. And his job was one job only, which was his whole life's job, was to kill as many Jews as he can. And the only Jews that were left in the European continent who basically were decimated were Hungarian Jews. There are approximately 800,000 or so Hungarian Jews left in March of 1944. Approximately 450,000 of them live in the outlying areas surrounding Budapest, and approximately 400,000 or so living in Budapest itself, again, giving more or less 10 to 20, 30,000, especially some people are baptized and intermarried. How do you consider them, et cetera, et cetera. Now, on Eichmann, that's his whole mission. On April 4th, a meeting is held with Eichmann and his three cronies, this guy Krumi, this guy Wisliski, and Kurt Becher. That foursome, Becher, Wisliski, Comey, and Eichmann, they are the architects of the destruction of Hungarian Jewry. On April 4th, 1944, they meet, and normally, the German plan was like a little bit like slower. Like when they got to Poland, so first they started just to terrorize the Jews. Then they say, you know what, we're going to move you into a ghetto. But the Warsaw Ghetto is not dissolved, is not destroyed until April of 1943. And it begins already in 41. So it's around for 2-3 years till they finally decide to liquidate the ghetto. It takes a while. Here they said, no, we're going into speed mode. We're going into speed mode. None of that. This is what we're going to do. Terrorize the Jews very quickly and ghettoize them very quickly and straight to Auschwitz as fast as you can count. April 4th, that's already the plan. And Hitler's meeting with his people, and they have to figure out how exactly they're going to run this whole thing. And basically, and here's where things get to be very, I guess, I don't know what to say, intellectually honest, if not emotionally honest, but intellectually honest, here's where things get a little bit dicey. Surprisingly, basically, Eichmann first does what he always does. He calls in the Jewish Council, the Judenrat. He basically makes them stand for like 4 hours until everybody is just shaking in their boots. And then he tells them, listen, if you work and you behave, we won't kill you. We'll beat you up a lot, but we won't kill you. So you better just behave or we will kill you. And that's what he does. But then he does a strange thing, Eichmann. Very strange thing. He calls in Joel Brand, who's the head of this Vad, or the co-head of this Vad of Hatzalah, Vad Ezra of Hatzalah, and he calls him in and he tells him, you know what? First he says, do you know who I am? You know who I am? I've killed 5 million Jews already. You know that. I've read, by the way, Herzl, the Judenstaat, the Jewish state. I know Hebrew even. He did. Eichmann lived in Israel for a while in the 1930s. Anyway, and he says to him, you know what? I'm a nice guy. You think I'm not a nice guy? I'm a nice guy, says Eichmann. You get me $100,000 and a few tons of coffee and some soap and some cigarettes or whatever, I don't know, and some dipsy doodles, whatever you want, a whole bunch of weird things, and I'll release 1 million Jews. I'll release 1 million Jews. Blood for goods, goods for blood. You get me, and I need trucks. I need trucks, 10,000 trucks. 10,000 winterized trucks, which I'm only going to be used on the Eastern Front against the Russians. And we all hate the Russians anyway, they're all commies. So give me 10,000 trucks, and I'll give you 100,000 Yidden, 1 million Yidden. I'll give you them, no problemo. Where am I going to get these trucks? Mr. Brand says. What do you mean where you get? Where you go get from, I don't know, from the Jews. So you're a Zionist, go to the Zionists. So the closest, they weren't going to fly to Israel, because no Israel, it's Palestine. Palestine was locked up by the British. So the next Jewish agency office was in Istanbul. Istanbul at that point was sort of like a Hefgeruel, easy place, didn't have that many laws, and whatever laws you could easily solve them with a few dollars. So he sells, Brand, go to Istanbul. Go to Istanbul and come back. And when you come back in a week or two with the money, and I'll give you the Jews. Tell me, well, with the trucks. You'll tell me where the trucks are coming from, and that's it. I'll give you the Jews, no problem. So Brand is flown off to Istanbul, and in the meantime, that's when our friend Kastner figures that Mrs. Brand must be lonely, so he joins up with her, and he goes with Mrs. Brand to meet Eichmann. Now, there is something of a backdrop which is actually, we can understand is true. There were two tzaddikim who lived in Bratislava. Bratislava is the capital of Slovakia. Slovakia is a country which is a bit northwest of Hungary, which was occupied by the Nazis. And there were two people there, Gysi Fleischmann and Rabbi Michal Ber Weissmandel. Gysi Fleischmann was brought up in a Haredische home, an Ungarische home. She was not an observant Jewess. She was a Zionist. 2 of her daughters already made Aliyah. She herself was not observant, but she was a tzaddikus. Rabbi Weissmandel writes beautiful things about her. And they were sort of like related to be honest with you, a little bit through marriage, because he married Rabbi Ungar. He married Rabbi Ungar's daughter, and she also was related, Gisi, with Rabbi Ungar as well. But her and Baruch Ber Michal Ber Weissmandel, they ran what was called the working group. Well, there's a whole thing historians still talk about, true, not true. From 1942 to 1944, the deportations to Treblinka stopped in Bratislava. And they paid lots of money, mostly by the Sternbachs, by the way, another drasha for another time. But the Sternbachs, Recha Sternbach, her husband Yitzchok Sternbach, they were very wealthy Yidden, they lived in Switzerland, they paid a lot of money, and they raised and they paid a lot of money. The deportations were stopped for 2 years. Historians, frankly, don't attribute it to the money paid by Weissmandel and Gysi Fleischman. They thought it did. If it did or it didn't, I don't know. I'm not here to judge. But they were the first that they paid this guy Wislinsky money. And Wislinsky, Taka, I don't know, $200,000, a lot of money at that time. And Taka, the deportations stopped. They were convinced it was their money. Weissmandel writes to everybody he could think of to let's make what he called a Europa Plan. He felt, he made a cheshbon, he was brilliant, by the way. Weissmandel was brilliant, besides being a tzaddik, an emistic tzaddik. Besides being a tzaddik gomer, he was brilliant. He used to go, we have letters, by the way. We have letters that he, when he was younger, he would visit the libraries in Oxford and examine manuscripts. And we have letters from the Bishop of Canterbury attesting that he should have permission to travel and permission to access libraries. Literally, he was a genius in everything, mathematics, everything. A brilliant man, and he would actually see manuscripts in the Oxford Library and correct the Oxfordian librarians as to the true author of these manuscripts. So Rav Weissmandel wrote letters to everyone and anyone. He made a cheshbon, he made an equation that for $3 million, what he called the Europa Plan, we could stop all the deportations in Europe. Now, and he really was the one who put in Brand and Kastner's mind this idea that we can bribe the Germans. Now, I want to tell you honestly that, of course, you don't have to be, everybody has their price. We know that, and it doesn't have to be, I'll make them an offer they can't refuse. But the reality is, obviously, there were individual Nazis who were bribed, obviously. Just like there are individuals all over the world who were bribed. However, it very well could be, and by the way, Rav Weissmandel, his whole life, at the end in 1944, the deportations in Slovakia resumed and all the Jews there were wiped out. And he was put on the train to Auschwitz. And he was such a brilliant man. He was such a devoted man. They allowed each Jew to take half a loaf of bread onto the train, the cattle car to Auschwitz. And he was so brilliant, he figured out, he knew this from beforehand. He figured out that there was a type of wire that could cut through the wood. And he inserted this wire blade inside his loaf of bread. And he actually sawed through the wood on the train. And even though his wife and 5 kids were on the train, he jumped from the train as it's moving because he felt, he made a cheshbon. Obviously, it killed him to lose his wife because in children he knew they were headed straight to Auschwitz. But he felt that he has a responsibility to the Jewish people because he was an amazing leader, and he felt this Europa Plan could really save millions of Jews, and he jumped from the train. and he gets to a bunker, and he hides in a bunker in Bratislava. He hides in a bunker in Bratislava until approximately January of 1945. And believe it or not, 4 days before the Russians liberate Bratislava, Kastner, with a Gestapo agent, actually comes to Bratislava and saves him, which is another whole cabal, and brings him to Switzerland to safety. When he arrives in Switzerland, he's a broken man because he realizes at that point that the final solution has been completed and all 6 million are dead. He has a heart attack. Eventually, he manages to come to the United States. He opens a yeshiva in Mount Kisco, New York. And he did remarry, and he did have, 4 or 5 kids more. One of his sons, by the way, died last year. Some of you remember it was a big storm. There was a flood by the Tappan Zee Bridge. By the Tappan Zee Bridge, it overflowed. That was his son. His son was, he was trying to call someone on the cell phone, and the water overcame it. One of his sons died then. But he was a broken man. His whole life he was a broken man. He died also, by the way, in 1957, just a few months. I think Kastner dies in March of 57. Weissman dies in November of 57. He was maybe 55, 56 years old. Dies also very young. Anyway, he wrote to Kastner. Weissman and Gitti Fleisch, they wrote to Kastner. So this idea of bribing Germans, specifically this guy Wislinsky, seemingly was going to work. And like I said, I'm sure individual Germans were bribable. Probably the mistake, unknowing to them, of course, the mistake of Weissmandl, Gitti Fleischman, and perhaps, if you want to be down the Chavschus, Kastner, perhaps, even though he may be different, was the belief that money will buy everything. And unfortunately, there was one thing for sure that the Nazis, or the top ones, loved more than money. And that was killing Jews. Killing Jews was al kulam. They sacrificed the entire war. They sacrificed hundreds of thousands of civilian Germans. They sacrificed billions of dollars in cities being bombed out, but everything to kill at least another Jew. And that was their mistake, because most historians believe that the halt on the Slovakian deportations had nothing to do with the money. Be it as it may, Kastner, who was known as a fixer, back when he was even a lawyer in the 30s in Kloisenberg, naturally, negotiations, money, that's something more up his alley. He approaches Wislinsky and he tells Wislinsky, can we stop the deportations? He has the letter from Weissmandl. So Wislinsky said, I'm second in command. The head honcho is Eisenman Yamach Shmoy V'Zichroi. That's when it starts that Eisenman Yamach Shmoy calls in Joel Brand and tells him, you know what, forget about, money's good too. But more, I need trucks. Joel Brand goes off to Istanbul. He gets to Istanbul. They tell him, when you get to Istanbul, you'll meet Reb Chaim. Maybe Reb Chaim Brisker, they don't know. He thinks it's Reb Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann is after Ben Gurion, is the Mr. Zionist himself. He gets there, it's not Chaim Weizmann, it's this guy Chaim Bartel, who's an underling, who's a nothing. Oh, you want to make a thing? You gotta talk to the British. We don't, Israel, we don't have trucks. The Jewish ancient for Vesapis, where are we going to get trucks? You have to talk to the British. Where are the British? You have to go to their local headquarters. Where's the local headquarters? In Egypt. Egypt, that's where they are. How am I going to get to Egypt? It's no big deal. It's a hop, skip, and a jump from Istanbul to Aleppo. Aleppo doesn't exist anymore. It used to be called Chalabim. The Jews in Ocean Parkway in Brooklyn, they come from Aleppo, Chalab. I think the guy there, Assad, whatever, in there, I think he bombed it out already. Bekitzer, he gets to Aleppo, and I got to meet with the British. Instead, they say, you got to meet with the British? No, you got to meet with these handcuffs. And they lock him up, and they lock him up. And the British, and the Times of London prints in the page, this Jew, Joel Brand, has the chutzpah to come to ask the British to go ahead and collaborate with the Germans against our allies, our good buddies, Joe Stalin, by having the audacity and the chutzpah to ask for 100,000 trucks, winterized no less, to help in the war. And Echtigatog, he's locked up in Aleppo, then to Cairo, whatever, he's out of the picture. So here's where Kastner enters, and here's where things get dicey. Kastner and Hansi Brand, what she's doing, what she's not doing, but we're talking about Kastner, let's leave her out. Kastner goes to Eichmann, and he starts quote-unquote negotiating. He says, where's Brand? Where's Brand? Brand's supposed to come back with the money or the trucks or the receipt for the trucks. Well, right. Oh, he's delayed. He got a headache. Whatever. He missed the boat. Whatever. All types of excuses. But he says, you know what? You got to show some good faith too. Maybe. Not clear. Not clear who says what. Here's where the dueling narratives. One narrative says that Eichmann said to Kastner, here's where the dueling narratives, this is where everything goes, whatever. According to narrative A, well, let's first get the pro-Kastner narrative. We'll get out that first. According to Anna Porter and the pro-Kastner narrative, that Kastner outwitted Eichmann. Kastner told Eichmann every story in the book. He's coming, he's on his way, he's got the trucks, he's starting the motor, he's getting them winterized, he's getting them gold-plated, whatever, he needs hubcaps, whatever it is, it's coming, it's on its way, it's on the boat, I just got the phone call. He keeps stalling Eichmann. And the pro-Kastner camp says he's stalling Eichmann for very good reason. Because the Russians already in April are at the door. They're ready, they're moving, they passed Romania already, they've taken Romania, now they're moving right into Hungary. Should be very soon that the war's over. So I'll just schlep along Eichmann for a little while, and voila, I'll save hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews. And then, as a show of good gesture, Kastner says, hey, my man Brand there is getting you trucks. How do I know you're going to release any Yidden? Maybe when they come, you'll kill them all. I want to see some live Yid now. So Eichmann says, okay, those items are fine. Take 600 Yidden. And then whatever, it went up to 1,200. At the end, it went up to 1,684. 1,684 people. Eventually, Eichmann says, "Zozain gesund." You can have them. A show of good faith, and I'm hard to say these words without whatever. That I'm an honest man. Can't say that though. That Eichmann says, and take your Yidden and take them out. Oh, and then Kastner, as always, a gross hero. She worked it out. He did what no man did. He outsmarted the devil himself. Yimach Shmoy himself, he outsmarted himself. He outsmarted him. He told him, a dreya here, a dreya here. They're coming, they're not coming. Yeah. In the meantime, give me 1,600 Yidden. Eichmann said, you know what, Taka, good idea, take him. He goes ahead, and he even says he built his Noah's Ark. He built his train as the Noah's Ark. What do you mean? Even though he's a Zionist, he's a big Zionist. I'm not going to just take Zionim. That's not fair. I'll take some, he takes the Satmarov, Satmarov gets to come, Rav Yonason Steif, the whole Kala dossier in Wien, big Kehillah in Williamsburg, beautiful Kehillah. The Debrecen Rov, not Rav Moshe Stern, a different Debrecen Rov. It takes him, the Kastner Rov, very choshev Yidden. Obviously, the most choshev is, of course, the Satmarov, obviously, and Rabbi Yonason Steif. And plus, he takes some poor people too, some poor orphans, bunch of orphans he takes too. You get on the train too. He calls it Noah's Ark. Because Shnayim Mikol. And he tells Eichmann, we got to go, and then they go, and unfortunately, whatever the reason, doesn't make such a big deal. It ends up in Bergen-Belsen. It's supposed to go to a neutral country, and from there to Palestine. That didn't work out. Okay, let's go to Switzerland. No, that didn't work out. We'll end up in Bergen-Belsen. Okay, at the end of the day, they arrive in Bergen-Belsen on July 7th, 1944. And we know on August 8th, 1944, 371 of the 1,684 people are released. And afterward, later on December, on Chof Aleph Kislev, the remaining 1,200 plus are released. And that's why if you make your way to either Williamsburg or Monroe on Chof Aleph Kislev, you're in for a good party, because that is the Yom Hatzalah. That is the Yom Hatzalah of the Satmarov. On Chof Aleph Kislev, the train passed into Switzerland out of Germany, and that's why to this day that's their very, very big celebration. And therefore, Kastner is a big hero. He saved 600 people, and out of those 1,600 people, they have thousands of obviously descendants. He saved all of them, and Satmar is because of them. We have Bikur Cholim kosher food now because of Kastner, and whatever, everything is Shalom al Yisrael, and he was killed, it's too bad, he was killed by a Meshuggah, and he's a hero. That's Anna Porter's story. Maybe. But there could be another narrative as well. Narrative B, again, I don't know. But not, well, even though I have a feeling, but whatever. Narrative B, that's not what happened at all. He never said to Eichmann, never ever said to Eichmann, give me Jews. Because you say to Eichmann, give me Jews, he gives you the gas chamber. You don't tell Eichmann, give me Jews. He had no power. He had no leverage. I'm sorry to bring this example. I'm really sorry to bring the example, especially on Tisha B'Av. Please be Michael me. Please. But sometimes these tzaddikim, these wonderful tzaddikim that come in the shul, that ask for donation, I'm sure they're all worthy. But sometimes I offer them money and they say that's not enough, I want more. And I say, I don't have any more. I'm giving you $50, I don't have more. They'll say, 100. I'll say, no, okay, 75. And then I think to myself, what are we leveraging here? Like what are we negotiating? What's your side? Like what I'm getting a bigger mitzvah? Like what's your side that we're negotiating all of a sudden? Lahavdil, Kastner had zero to negotiate. Eichmann knew that he wasn't getting trucks. Eichmann was brilliant. He didn't become Adolf Eichmann. You don't become the evilest man in the world by sitting around doing nothing. You don't. You just don't. You become the evilest man in the world by working on being the evilest man in the world. You have to work hard to be the evilest man in the world. It's an avodah. And he worked very hard on being the evilest man in the world. That meant thinking every little thing of how evil I can be. Every little thing, how evil can I be? How can I hurt somebody even more? That's an avodah that took a lot of effort. Eichmann knew lechatchila nechte getog. He knew that the British are not giving him one winterized truck. Knew it. He suggested it. Not Brand. Not Kastner. Eichmann said, give me the trucks, and I'll give you the Yidden. Now, he knew that he wasn't getting the trucks. For whatever reason, he threw Brandt to Istanbul, get him out. He threw Brandt from Istanbul for a different reason. He sat with him with this guy, get another story, this guy Gross, who was a converted Jew, who was a triple agent, a double agent, a quadruple agent. Whoever you want to get him work, that's who he worked for. He was sent by Himmler, Yamach Shmoy V'Zikro. Himmler also was in the I Hate Jew Club. Himmler at that was a smart man too. And Himmler knew at the end that the Nazis are going to lose. And Himmler, this we know for sure from other things, was sending out feelers to the Western world. Hey, you know what? I'll make a side deal with you, and you'll get me out of this Meshuggah Hitler guy. And, you know, I don't want to die. This guy Hitler's wacko. And he sent Brandt to Istanbul to meet the British. He knew the British couldn't care less about Brandt and his trucks. First of all, the British, the guy, we have it in writing. When they asked the British guy, whatever it was, Lord, whatever it was, they asked him, he wants to release 1 million Jews. The British guy said, who wants 1 million Jews? Where am I going to put them? I don't need them. Let Hitler deal. I don't know, what do I want 1 million Jews? But I need some 1 million problems. It was no shaila. He wanted this guy, Gross, whatever, Gross, with a Hungarian name, that he was going to make contact with the British, and somehow, and since he was a shady guy, no one would suspect that he was really sent out feelers via Himmler to see if he can arrange some sort of deal with the West to make a separate peace. Okay. In the meantime, Eichmann had one fear. Now, Eichmann was a Tsar German, such a Yamach Shmoy German. I'm sorry to tell you this so graphically. But when he was captured, Baruch Hashem, by the Mossad, and he wouldn't do a thing. He wouldn't do a thing without asking permission. Yavo! Yes. To the extent that when they took him to the restroom, he wouldn't begin procedures until he asked permission. Can I now go to the next step? He was as submissive, everything he asked permission for. Everything was calculated, everything was obedience, everything exactly had to go straight according to schedule. Eichmann made a cheshbon that I have to get 12,000 Jews a day gassed. 12,000 a day. It's like Kimat, not quite, but almost a whole Psayik. Maybe the whole Clifton. Beginning on May 7th till July 7th, a day was never missed. The 12,000 Jews a day went straight to Auschwitz. He had built a special line called the Yiddish ramp, the Yidden ramp. It was a ramp that he had built, a train ramp that went right, the pictures of it, the famous Auschwitz album, you can see it online. Somebody recently donated it to Yad Vashem, a story in of itself. There was after the war, a refugee woman, she was dying. They didn't know where to put her in a DP camp. They put her in an old German barrack somewhere in Germany. And she opened up the drawer next to her bed and she sees there's a photo album, 156 pictures. She give a cook and there's her sister. Happened to be that they're not sure exactly who did it, that the Nazis had this picture, they try to destroy everything, that everything never gets destroyed. 156 pictures documenting all the Hungarian Jews coming to Auschwitz, from the time of arrival in the train until walking to the gas chamber. Until walking to the gas chamber. You could see them walking to the gas chamber. It's online. Later on, someone convinced her to give it to Yad Vashem, Baruch Hashem. So 12,000, he starts on May 7th, 12,000. Nothing stops. When Joel Brand flies off on May 15th to Istanbul, 12,000 Jews are at Auschwitz. 11,500 are gassed there without moving 10 feet. Not like the Polish Jews. The Hungarian Jews, with their clothes, with their shoes, with everything, were taken directly from the ramp into the shower room to undress, to tie their shoes together that they wouldn't lose them when they came out of the shower. They were stuffed in so tightly into the gas chamber that the Nazis would shoot into the gas chamber to force the Jews that first came in to push up against the wall so they could push more people in. And then they dropped the Cyclone B pellets. They were pushed so tight that there were some air pockets which the gas could not penetrate. It could take over 30 minutes for people to die. The Jews that were forced to take the bodies out had to use metal hooks to separate the bodies. Some people's arms were longer than their bodies, because in desperation they were trying to get out. Never missed a day. Not the days when Eichmann met with Kastner, not the days when Brad was in Istanbul. Never missed a day. 12,000 Jews a day, every day. Almost 500,000 Jews would be gassed by July 7th. Narrative B. Eichmann was such a stickler for laws and rules and obedience, is that he had one fear. And Himmler told him this, and Himmler was above him. No Warsaw Ghetto again. We had Bizyanis there in Warsaw. 30,000 Polish, a half-dead Yidden, held the Wehrmacht and the SS for 33 days. 33 days they held us at bay, these half-starved, worthless vermin. It was a busha. It was a busha for the Aryan race. The Aryan race, these Untermenschen, these non-humans, held the Wehrmacht and the SS for 33 days. Never again. Can't happen. Eichmann was terrified. The Hungarian Jews were healthy. The Polish Jews were starved. For 3 years they were starved. 600 people a day died in the Warsaw Ghetto from starvation. The Hungarian Jews were healthy, strapping people. And as far as arms, they had very good relations, many of them, with Hungarian, even ex-soldiers. There was no reason there shouldn't have been an uprising. So Eichmann, according to narrative B, said to Kastner Azai, listen, Kastner, I'll give you 600 Yidden. Eventually it goes to 1,600, whatever. I'll give you 600 Yidden, but I want something back from you now. Now! What's that? You keep your mouth shut. You keep your mouth shut. I'll give you those Jews. And you know what? You open your mouth once, I'm not going to send those Jews where you think they're going to go. Mysteriously, they end up in Bergen-Belsen, and nächtige Tag, they'll mysteriously end up in Bergen-Belsen. Was he stupid, Eichmann? The genius of evil himself. Eichmann had no plans to send them to a neutral country and then to Palestine. Eichmann had no Havamina to send them to Switzerland. What, are you out of your mind? He sent them to Bergen-Belsen. He kept them hostage. Until finally, and you know why? In December of 1944, he finally lets them go? Because on December 24th, 1944, Eichmann finally realizes, that's the day he leaves Budapest. Until December 24th, 1944, which is almost when he lets the Jews finally of Bergen-Belsen, the last 1,300, go into Switzerland, he kept them there. Because he kept thinking, I'm going to kill those Jews in Budapest. He didn't, thank God, most of them. But Kastner was tricked. And that's why Kastner agreed to this deal, which was proffered by Eichmann, not by him, and he was negotiating nothing. Rather, Eichmann said to him, you keep, and Eichmann said even more, he said, Eichmann, you're from Kloisenberg, right? You're from Kloisenberg. Originally it was only 600. Make sure you get a lot of Yidden from Kloisenberg on that train. 377 people on that train were in Kloisenberg. It's a lot of good friends. Of course his wife was on the train. Versteht, who else are you going to save? You save your wife. That's not a chiddush. His wife's parents also, okay, look, you got to get along with your shver. But his wife's brother, his wife's brother's aunt, his shver's cousin, 377 people. Originally, even of the 1,600, it's a huge percentage. All came from Kloisenberg. But it gets worse. It gets worse. May 3rd, 1944. Somehow, nobody could travel. By May of 1944, if you were a Jew, you wore your yellow star. You only were out 2 hours a day to go buy some milk and cookies, and then you hid in your house. And by the way, every day when the Allies would bomb Budapest, the Allies started bombing Budapest in April. Rav Eisenman was begging them to bomb the tracks to Auschwitz. We don't have no planes for that. All planes are booked, no planes for that. But they were bombing Budapest already. In April and May of 1944, every time they bombed and Christian homes were destroyed, the Nazis made the Jews, next day, we need 500 of your homes evacuated for Christian families who were left homeless. We need 1,000 homes evacuated for the Christians who were left homeless. It was terrible. You couldn't have a radio. You couldn't have a car. You couldn't have a telephone. By the way, you should know, some of these Hungarian Jews, many of them, were wealthy, not so stam wealthy. I mean, like wealthy. Like 60% of all lawyers in Budapest were Jewish, even though they're only like something like 14% of the population. In all the high-paying professions, the Jews were very well represented. They all had cars, not everyone, but certainly many of them had cars, telephones, radios for sure. All that was confiscated. And make sure you wear that yellow star that we can always see if we want to give you a punch or a smack or push you in the Danube River. We'll know who they are. One man didn't. One man in all of Budapest didn't wear a yellow star. One man in all of Budapest had a car. One man in all of Budapest had a telephone. One man in all of Budapest had a radio. And that man's name was Rejo Kastner. And amazingly so, he's driving with a Gestapo agent to Kloisenberg from Budapest. couple of hour drive. Him and Mr. Wislensky are going to Kloisenberg. It's a funny thing to do. It's May 3rd, 1944. To keep things short, the Auschwitz protocols, which were two Polish inmates from Auschwitz who escaped, who gave detailed reports of not only of verifying the mass killings of Auschwitz, but verifying the fact that the Germans are building new crematoriums and new gas chambers, and that the German guards are talking, we're going to be eating Hungarian salami in a few weeks. Because the Jews were told they can bring with them food on the train. And they pre-warned, including Kastner, on April 30th, 1944. And remember, by April 4th already, Eichmann had everything planned. And Wislensky told him already, also in late April. On May 3rd, 1944, Rezo Kastner knew very well that the Jews are going to be going straight into the gas chamber. And he doesn't tell a soul. Doesn't tell a soul. Doesn't tell a soul. No, nobody. Tells a few people, there might be two trains maybe. One train is going to a fake place, is going to Wonderville, Virginia. They made it, I forgot the name now. Some Hungarian name. We're going to Wonderville, Virginia. There it's going to be Geschmack. He even told people, make sure when that train comes, get on real fast. Get on, because whoever gets there fast gets the best rubes. May 3rd, 1944. Doesn't tell anybody. Doesn't tell a soul. May 15th, 1944. 377 people from Kloisenberg are telling, well, we're going on a different train. We're going on a train to Palestina, and you guys are going on a train to Wonderville, Virginia. Never told a soul. Never told a soul. Not just their Siget. Eli Wiesel, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, Eli Wiesel. He writes a number of times in his books, I knew we were two kilometers from the Romanian border. Well, the whole family could have got there in an hour. Kloisenberg is 5 kilometers from the Romanian border. Anybody would have made it? No. Some people might have made it. You know how SS guards Eichmann gave to guard? They took the Jews out of Kloisenberg. The ghetto was for just a week or two, even less maybe, in an old brickyard. You can still see it. I don't want to go see it, but I saw pictures. It's still there. It's still the broken brick outside of town. Half roofs that they made them sleep there for 2 weeks. In that brickyard, where they had to stay waiting for supposedly the deportations that were going to come out. So not only did he never tell anybody that people could have meant to Romania, there were healthy men there. I mean, someone could have taken there were 2 to 3 SS guards for 18,000 Jews. 18,000 Jews in Kloisenberg, there were 2 to 3 SS guards. There were Hungarian guards, Germanda, whatever. Though they had Hungarian, but even they were maybe 100. It was a chance. They knew about the Warsaw Ghetto at that point. A few days later, this man Kohani, who worked for Kastner. Mail call, comes to Kloisenberg, mail call. Oh, what's on the mail call? That time I can read you all this. We get to the trial, we'll get there very soon. It's all in the trial transcript. You can look it up yourself. Mail call. What's in the mail call? Hey, dear Achves, I don't know, Hans and Fradi, I don't know. We're in Wonderville, Virginia. It's geschmack here. It's great. Air conditioned. 8-course meals. Geschmack, come quickly. Signed, your good friends, Fritz and Fanny. They gave it out to the people by the direction of Reza Kastner. The deportations never stopped until 500,000 Jews were gassed in Auschwitz in cold blood. As Elie Wiesel said, never knowing until they were on the train where they were going and without any options. Finally, on July 7th, miracle of miracles, miracles of miracles, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt contacts Admiral Horthy and tells him, you will face military might of the United States if you continue to deport the Jews. The Auschwitz protocols made its way, shockingly enough, to no newspaper less than the paper of record, the New York Times. By May of 1944, the protocols had reached the New York Times. The entire world knew that Jews were being exterminated en masse in the most horrific, high-tech method ever devised by man. 12,000 Jews per day. Never missed a day, 7 days a week. Horthy finally steps in and says to Hitler, "Das ist enough. Enough. The Budapest Jews haven't been deported yet. Approximately 435,000 Jews left in Budapest. So from July till about, Hitler keeps saying, let's get them going, we got to kill the Jews. His generals are telling him the Russians are banging down the doors, we got to get at it. No, what are you, Russians? You got to kill Jews. Most important thing in the world is to kill a Jew, nothing more important. Finally, in July, in August, finally in October, Hitler says, genug, this is enough. And Hitler goes ahead with Hermann Göring, Yimach Shemai V'Zichro, another of the most evilest men in the world, and they actually kidnap Horthy's son, believe it or not. They take him away. Eventually he's taken, by the way, to Buchenwald. They take him away and they tell Horthy, if you ever want to see your son alive, basically abdicate. You want to still call yourself regent, but the game's over. October 24th, 1944, Eichmann comes back to Budapest. I have a job to finish. I haven't finished the job. There are 400,000 left. I always finish my jobs. Thankfully, there's one problem by this time in October. Even the German army can't afford any trains. Can't afford trains, and they even can't afford fuel. The Germans, remember, June 6, 1944, Normandy. By October of 1944, the Allies are basically banging on the door of Berlin almost. Hitler tries one last stance with the Battle of the Bulge, but the war is over. What does Eichmann do? He said, you know what? If you can't take a train to Auschwitz, you'll walk to Auschwitz. And he begins death marches. He begins death marches, not to Auschwitz, but into Vienna. He'll march them out of Hungary into Austria, and there he'll kill them. Thankfully, A, it's obviously not a very efficient way. B, at this point, a great tzaddik by the name of Raoul Waldenberg from Sweden is already there, and he's issuing Schutzpasses, these passes that the Jews can use. Even supposedly the Vatican is involved in putting pressure. The war is going horrifically terrible for the Nazis. And finally, the Russians start their final assault against Budapest. November 1944, they begin to surround Budapest. And it's very difficult at that point. Jews are being killed. The Arrow Cross, who was the Hungarian equivalent of Nazis, are given free rein. They're officially now in charge. They're the government. They've been free rein. A number of incidents where they raid the Jewish hospitals, Jewish orphanages, they kill, they violate, they murder, they decapitate, they mutilate. Thousands of Jews, they throw them off the Danube River. But thankfully, on December 25th, 1944, finally, Pest is captured, is liberated by the Russians. A few weeks later, Buda, they crossed the Danube, Buda, but it doesn't matter at this point because, thank God, on December 24th, Eichmann Yimach Shmo finally gets into his Mercedes-Benz for the last time and leaves Budapest. Where's our friend Kastner? Where is he now? Where is he in December 1944? The war does not end till May 8th, 1945. Yes, the Russians have liberated Auschwitz in January of 1945. Yes, they've liberated Budapest in January and February 1945. But the war is still going on until May. Bergen-Belsen is, although it doesn't have gas chambers, there are plenty of other ways to kill Jews. Mauthausen is still functioning. Dachau is still functioning. So here's where things get very dicey, where even the pro-Kastner camp has no answer. Kastner is flying around Europe in the company of no one less than Kurt Becher. Kurt Becher, who's also a lieutenant colonel, the exact same right as Eichmann Yimach Shmoi v'Zichroi. He's in charge of the economic division of the SS. What's the economic division of the SS? Sounds so banal. He's in charge of when, before the men and women of Hungary were put on the trains, if he had any suspicion, which basically means he had every suspicion, that you were hiding, like we had Mr. Buxbaum, Zicharno Levracha, who lived right around on Van Houten and Waverly, the menorah that he hid and the Leichtig that he hid in Krakow is still probably buried in the cellar there, that he knew Jews had buried jewels and valuables. They were getting on the train. So to make sure he got those, Kurt Becher's job was to torture the Jews. His favorite torture was torturing mothers in front of their family by placing electronic prods in every orifice of the body. Another favorite practice of his was taking children and torturing them in front of parents. It made no difference if these people had money or they didn't. That was his pastime. And Mr. Kastner is flying around Europe, Austria, Berlin. For 4 days he stays in Kurt Becher's house in Berlin. Don't believe me. Please don't believe me, please. Please. If you want to throw up, so go on YouTube, put in Kurt Becher, and you'll watch how Kurt Becher lived to the ripe old age of 90 plus, was one of the richest men in Germany. And he'll speak about his friend, Rudolf Kastner. Heißt Rudolf, und ich bin Kurt. We were good friends, first name basis. What's he doing? Maze. What is he doing? But it gets worse. The war ends. And after the war ends, in 1947, Kastner emigrates to Israel, Palestine. By the way, just one example, please. One example, please, of Mr. Kastner, of what he's doing. Supposedly, by the way, officially, pro-Kastner camp, supposedly he had orders, which no one has. No one has ever seen them. They've never surfaced somehow. And somehow, strangely, they were never even obeyed. Isn't that strange? But supposedly he had orders from Himmler. Him and Kurt Becher had orders from Himmler to go around to concentration camp and give orders that ceasing of killing of Jews has to stop immediately. Even though we have no record of that occurring, and we do have records of up until the last days of Bergen-Belsen, of Jews being slaughtered en masse. So let's pick up over here of one story where Kastner is coming to, I believe this is in Mauthausen. No, this is Bergen-Belsen. Here we are, Bergen-Belsen. The site of Bergen-Belsen and its survivors, right? And this is from Porter. It's from Ann Porter. Remember her, right? She's Ann Porter. The true story of an unknown hero of the Holocaust. Here's the true story of an unknown hero. Hero. Here we go. But by then, of course, it was too late for the 6 million Jews. The sight of Bergen-Belsen and its survivors was so horrific that Kastner would never be able to speak of it again. In the mud and the excrement, dead bodies were piled up next to the living. In the barracks, people slept 10 or 12 to each narrow wooden shelf. More skeletons of men and women were staggering about or crawling, most of them dreadfully wounded, disfigured, maimed, afflicted with diseases, infested with lice, neither talking nor hearing. The last arrivals were lying outside in the mud, all young women, all dead. Yet nevertheless, the storage house contained mountains and mountains of Red Cross food parcels, medication, clothing, none of it which was ever distributed to the inmates. Years later, an Israeli interviewer asked Becher, why didn't he command that at least the food and the clothing be distributed immediately? This is from the Hero book. Becher stared into space and asked, could you repeat that question? The question was repeated, but he continued to stare into space. Anyway, what did they do in the camp? Becher, supposedly, negotiated with the commander, SS Captain Josef Kramer, in his office for 2 days. 2 days to give Himmler's orders, while Jews are being killed by the second. While Kastner waited outside. I'm sorry about this. You have to put on your, I don't know what glasses to hear this. On the second day, a filthy old woman in rags, her head shaved, her hands arthritic claws, shambled up to him where he stood, erect in his clean suit and his tie. And in a hoarse voice, she begged, "Please, please, can I have some bread for my dying daughter?" Kastner did not respond. She said, Rezo, don't you know me?" At that moment, Becher came out of the office and said, "Kastner, let's go." Quickly, the two of them went to their guarded vehicle. It was only later on that Kastner suddenly realized that that old woman was Joel Brand's sister, Chana. To his everlasting shame and horror, he never returned to find her. That's a nice man. What a nice man. By the way, Brand's mother, brother, sister, Eichmann Yamach Shmo, never let them out of Bergen-Belsen. Neither on the transport in August 1944 nor on the transport of December. They were the only three people who were never allowed out of Bergen-Belsen. Even though our friend and enemy Becher supposedly gave an order that no one should be killed, they were eventually dumped in a cattle car with, by the way, hundreds of thousands of other Jews, that when the war ended was left on the tracks. When they finally someone opened the cattle car, wherever it was, somewhere in Germany, Brand's mother was dead, and his sister, who describes over here, was barely alive. That's what Kastner was doing. Kastner gets to Eretz Yisrael. He expects a hero's welcome. He thinks he's the greatest tzaddik of the world. He joins the Mapai party. He runs on the 54th spot. Mapai gets only 51 seats. He becomes the communications director for the Ministry of Transportation. However, unfortunately for him, memories, lots of memories, don't just dissolve. Wherever he goes, people recognize him. He speaks at a Mapai conference, and he's interrupted by a Mapainik. "How dare you speak? You murderer! You murderer!" He was taken, official complaints were registered against him at the World Zionist Congress, both in 1946 and in 1947. However, it's only finally in 1952 when Michael Greenwald publishes this pamphlet, which gets half the readership of my short Vart, which says that he's a collaborator, that somehow, he himself doesn't do anything, by the way. He himself doesn't do anything. Free country. Chaim Cohen. You know what Chaim Cohen was? He's a Talmud of Rav Kook, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha. A Yekish Yid who in 1932 went to learn in Merkaz Harav. He learned by Rav Kook, he got smicha. Unfortunately, he made a big mistake because in 1935 he went back to Deutschland to go to the University of Frankfurt, where he filled his mind with stupidity, and he became a lawyer, threw his yarmulke in the garbage, threw God in the garbage, and he came back to Israel, and he became the Attorney General. But he was obviously a bright man. He was one of, by the way, the judges who judged Eichmann. He says, Attorney General Cohen says, no, this little mimeographed paper, it's against a representative of the government of the State of Israel. He levels the charge of collaboration. We can't let this go. It can't be. We are going, the government of State of Israel versus Malkiel Greenwald, for the charge of libel, January 1st, 1955. 54 now, I forget. The trial begins. Everybody's assuming it's going to be an open and shut case. Everyone's assuming this guy, Greenwald, this from a Yid, can't even speak Ivrit, only speaks Yiddish, has his teeth knocked out, a Lechi guy, even worse. We're going to make mud of him. He finds pro bono this amazing lawyer by the name of Shmuel Tamir. Shmuel Tamir, a young man in his 30s, who would eventually rise during Menachem Begin's premiership to be the Minister of Justice. By then is a no-name lawyer, is brilliant. And he transforms the case into not just a case where he proves, January 1st, 1954, where he proves not only does he prove that the libel is a false charge, that every accusation, remember the beginning of the lecture way back when, 3 hours ago, when we said that Tzchim lechasel at Kastner, we have to eliminate Kastner, shitef pulai im Nazim. He collaborated with the Nazis. Shmuel Tamir, not only does he defend Greenwald that there is no libel, he flips the trial on its lid, and it basically becomes a trial proving that Kastner is a collaborator with the Nazis. And what does he do, Shmuel Tamir? He brings in people from Cluj, from Kloisenberg, I'm sorry. Cluj is the Hungarian name. We call it Kloisenberg. And he brings in people from Kloisenberg. And they tell him how that all the stories that we said before, how on May 3rd he came and he never said a word, and how they would have ran to the Romanian border, or they would have picked up a stick and smashed the gendarme in the head, or they would have fought with their knives, they would have fought with their feet, they would have fought with their nails. They would have done anything except running to get a front seat on the train to hell. If only he would have told them. And they said that if they would have known, they would have killed him when he came back. They would have killed him if he would have came back to Kloisenberg after the war. And then he bought, which was the most crushing, but the most damning part was that at the end, in the fall and winter of 1944, the British finally agreed to train Jewish parachutists and to send them into Yugoslavia and for them to infiltrate into Hungary, to foment a rebellion of the Hungarian Jews a la the Warsaw Ghetto. He sent 2 men and a woman, believe it or not. That woman to this day is enshrined as one of the heroines of the state of Israel. There's not a Jewish child alive in the state of Israel that does not know the name of Haganah and Palmach. Stennis was one of the paratroopers. She was arrested by the Hungarians. She was caught as she tried to infiltrate from Yugoslavia. There are women in the audience, so I'm going to leave out the details of what happened. But suffice to say, notwithstanding the horrific torture she experienced, she would not give away the code to the transmitter that she had with her, which connected her to British intelligence. She remained a heroine. She stood her ground. She wouldn't collaborate with the enemy. While she was in prison, she was officially a Hungarian citizen. She was born in Hungary. She made Aliyah in the 1930s. She had Hungarian citizenship. Officially, she was allowed to have a lawyer and a trial. Everybody told her, go to Rabbi Kastner. Her mother was still in Hungary. They told her, go to Rabbi Kastner. He's the one who could pull all the strings. He's the one who can get you the lawyer. He's the one who can help you. Tamir, what did you do to help Stennis? Well, we held meetings in the committee over what steps to take. At the end, the mother testified that not only did he never help her, he refused to meet with Stennis' mother. Stennis' mother still lived in Hungary. She went to visit her daughter in prison. She saw the physical state of her daughter, of her beaten-in face. And they told her, go to Kastner. But Kastner refused. Mrs. Stennis asked me for one thing, to get her a lawyer for the trial that was coming. I asked. They all said, the only people you need is Kastner. He's the person. Not only that, they told her, Kastner has the right to visit every prisoner. Why hasn't he visited my daughter? This is at the trial, at the libel trial. I asked for Kastner's address. Oh, that's impossible. We can't give you Kastner's address. That's impossible. Finally, I got his address. I went there. I spoke to a woman. That woman, by the way, is Hansi Brand. My daughter is one of the parachutists from Palestine. Oh, yes, we know all about it. Dr. Kastner will do all he can. You know what? I'll give you Dr. Kastner's office. You'll find him there. I went to Dr. Kastner's office. His secretary said she's not there. He's not home. Later, I found out that secretary was Hansi Brand. Mr. Kastner, he's the one on the witness stand, asked Tamir, did you take food packages to Stennis? No, we couldn't. I tried. In fact, I tried many days, Mrs. Stennis. Every other food package we sent got through. Why wouldn't yours get through? But unfortunately, it was too late. Because one day, when Mrs. Stennis went to visit her daughter, they told her at the prison, your daughter was taken out and shot by firing squad. Her last words were, I'm proud to be a Jewess. In 1950, her body was brought to Israel. She was given a heroine's funeral. But Kastner had no time to meet with her. Kastner had no time to help her. Kastner was too busy going to lunch with Kurt Becher. She died a hero's death, alone, starved. Even Chaim Cohen, who took over the who even though he was Attorney General, took over the prosecution himself, didn't have the audacity to cross-examine Hannah Stennis' mother. Unfortunately, it gets worse. Revealed at the trial that for some reason Dr. Kastner went to Nuremberg 6 times. 6 times. 6 times he went to testify on behalf of 4 Nazis. Becher, who was involved in the electric prods and who was personally involved in the Einsatz group in the beginning of the war. Krumi, who was known as a particularly vicious Nazi. Wislensky, who would eventually be killed by firing squad by a Czech court in 1947. But Kastner testified. Let me read you a letter. Most honorable Mr. Krumi, most honorable Mr. Krumi, most honorable Mr. Hitler. I have sent a report to the Zionist Congress in Basel in which I have officially clarified and identified the work done by those who are of the help to the Jews. I hope that my efforts in your behalf will enable you to regain your freedom and start a new life. I shall do all that I can to help you in this matter. With heartiest regards, Dr. Rudolf Kastner. Now, besides the fact that when questioned at the libel trial by Tamir, did you ever give any affidavits for any Nazis? Any category? He said no. Besides to the fact that when asked, do you believe it's a war crime and that collaboration with the Nazis was punishable by death? In Israel, it's still no Nazis left, but still, do you agree that collaboration with the enemy is a crime? Of course. Are you sure you never testified on behalf of Kurt Becher, Kolmy, Wislinsky, anybody? I'm sure. Well, at that point, Shmuel Tamir asked for exhibit number 22, which was the official affidavit that Dr. Rudolf Kastner had made on behalf of Kurt Becher. According to the American authorities, the only reason that Kurt Becher was never tried for war crimes, notwithstanding his hands were so bloodied with Jewish blood, was because of Dr. Kastner. He writes, unfortunately, it goes on with how the different testimonies he gave, but this I have to read you. This was the affidavit that Shmuel Tamir produced, that Dr. Rudolf Kastner categorically lied after taking an oath on the Tanakh in court in Yerushalayim Yer Kodesh. Here's what he lied about. Tamir, on page 299 of this court record, you agreed with me that to intercede on behalf of any high SS official, including Becher, is a crime from our national point of view. Kastner, of course it is. Tamir, allow me to read you something. I, the undersigned Dr. Rudolf Kastner, wish to make the following statement in addition to my affidavit submitted to the International Military Tribunal under document 2605 concerning former Lieutenant Colonel Kurt Becher. There can be no doubt about it that Becher belongs to the very few SS leaders having the courage to oppose the program of annihilation of the Jews and tried to rescue human lives. Having been in personal contact with Becher from June 1944 to April 1945, I should like to emphasize on the basis of personal observation that Kurt Becher did everything within the realm of possibilities to save innocent human beings from the blind fury of the Nazi leaders. Therefore, even if the form and the basis of our negotiations may be highly objectionable, I never doubted for one moment the good intentions of Kurt Becher. In my opinion, when his case is judged by the Allies or German authorities, Kurt Becher deserves the fullest possible consideration. I make this statement not only in my name, but also in the name of the Jewish Agency and the Jewish World Congress. Signed, Dr. Rudolf Kastner, Official Jewish Agency in Geneva, Chairman of the Zionist Organization in Hungary, Representative of the Joint Distribution Committee in Budapest. This was so shocking. This was so shocking that the judge, Binyamin Halevi, turned to the, I don't want to say defendant, because frankly he was the plaintiff. Turned to Kastner and said, Judge Halevi asked the red-faced Kastner, who gave you permission to offer this affidavit in the name of the Jewish Agency? Kastner said, Dobkin and Barlis gave me permission. Well, later on, Dobkin is called into the stand, and he admits that he never saw Kastner before in his life until that trial, and he never communicated with him any permission. Sorry to keep you here, but it's Tisha B'Av, and we have to recall what Stennis Chidim is. And we have to realize how low a person can fall if we want to know how high a person can go. This is a letter. The Americans arrested Kurt Becher as a war criminal. The indictment read, Kurt Becher, Lieutenant General SS, place of crimes, Budapest, Mauthausen. Crimes committed, torture of innocent people. Advocate Rapp, who's the American lawyer dealing against Becher, says the following under oath. To the best of my knowledge, Kastner arrived in Nuremberg as a voluntary witness on behalf of SS Colonel Kurt Becher, and I gained the definite impression that his visit was aimed solely to assist Becher. Until the arrival of Kastner, it was highly probable that we would have tried Becher as an SS criminal, as a result of Kastner's pleadings and endeavors on behalf of Becher, many of my staff slowly began to regard Becher with sympathy, and personally went out of their way to assist him in every possible way. On numerous occasions, I observed interrogations and friendly, if not warm, conversations with Becher. With conduct on my part of my staff was unprecedented and contrary to our rule, insofar as members of the SS were concerned. Upon my inquiry for such apparent unwarranted conduct, I was given to understand that this case was an exception to the normal rule. It was the first and only time that we were furnished proof with regards to a high-ranking SS officer that Becher was personally instrumental in saving the lives of tens of thousands of Jews. Becher's ultimate release, this is by the American representative. These were from records that Shmuel Tabir was able to find in the Pentagon archives, in wherever, Annapolis, Virginia, wherever they are. He closes. Becher's ultimate release was solely the result of Kastner's pleadings and the contents of his sworn testimony. His affidavit regarding Becher was the main, if not the sole reason underlying our reason to free him. This was shocking. The court was shocked. The entire state of Israel was shocked. Nobody could believe a Jew in 1946 would on his own fly to Germany to testify on behalf of the devil himself. Unheard of. Unbelievable. When Judge Halevi heard all the testimony, it took 9 months for him to write his decision. At the end, after he had all the evidence before him, Benjamin Halevi was the one who decided that there was no doubt in his mind that Israel Kastner had collaborated with the enemy. And Israel Kastner has sold his soul to the devil. For those of you who aren't familiar, there's a German writer named Goethe who wrote a story about a man named Faust. This character Faust, in the novel, in order to gain pleasures of this world, he sells his soul to the devil, that he has to do what the devil wants in order to get his pleasures. And that's exactly what he felt Israel Kastner did. But I have to just end for a moment. But let's get a different perspective. Adolf Eichmann, Yamach Shemai V'Zichroi, with the help of the Catholic Church in Italy, was given an international passport, which he used to transport himself to Argentina, where he resettled in Argentina with his family, working at the Mercedes-Benz factory. He had an interesting practice. On Sundays, he lived outside Buenos Aires. On Sunday, he would take a bus to Buenos Aires. And another Nazi, a lot of ex-Nazis in Buenos Aires. And they had a little ex-Nazi club. And this Dutch Nazi sympathizer, I think by the name of Hassan, every Sunday, something like 76 hours worth of recordings. Eichmann would, in gross graphic detail, tell his role in the Holocaust. And then, carefully and scrupulously, as only a German can do, Hassan would transcribe the spoken word into type, and the next week would give it to Eichmann, who added his notes. By the way, as an aside, those tapes were finally discovered somewhere in the 1970s. Somehow, the West German government got hold of them and locked them up, of course. No one should hear what wonderful people they produce in Germany. And only this 7 months ago, it was actually one of the lead stories in the New York Times within the month, 2 months ago. Finally, Germany agreed to allow an Israeli academic production or school or academic project to listen to those tapes. And I didn't hear, thank God, but you hear the voice of Eichmann himself as he proudly tells everyone how happy he is that he'll be able to jump into the grave knowing at that point he had killed, he felt, 5 million Jews. But the transcripts were around. Now this guy Hasman, who made the transcripts, once they captured Eichmann, he said, hey, what's the next best thing to killing a Jew? Is making a few bucks off a dead Jew, right? So he contacted a magazine called Life magazine, which was a popular magazine at one point. Don't believe me, you can get all of Life online. All the magazines online. I went online. Because I knew Eichmann spoke about Kastner. This is before he's captured. He's a free man. Free. This is in 1958, 59. Free man. 10 years after the war. Let's see how Eichmann describes Dr. Kastner. Except perhaps for the first few sessions, Kastner never came to me fearful of the Gestapo strongman. We negotiated entirely as equals. People forget that. We were political opponents trying to arrive at a settlement, and we trusted each other perfectly. When he was with me, Kastner smoked cigarettes as though he was in a coffee house. While he talked, we would smoke one aromatic cigarette after another, taking them from his beautiful silver case and lighting them with his silver lighter. With great polish and reserve, he would have made an ideal Gestapo officer himself. I believed that Kastner would have sacrificed 1,000 or 100,000 of his blood to achieve his political goal. He was not interested in old Jews or those who had become assimilated into Hungarian society, but he was incredibly persistent in trying to save biologically valuable Jewish blood, that is human material that's capable of reproduction and hard work. You can have the others, he would tell me, but let me have this group here. And because Kastner rendered us a great service by helping keep the deportation camps peaceful, I would let his group escape. After all, I was not concerned with small groups of 1,000 or so Jews. But more shocking is something else I discovered. Eli Wiesel, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, used to work for the Yediot Achronot. Most people don't know that. Before Night is published in the 1960s, he was a journalist, and he wrote for Yediot Achronot. I want to read to you something in English translation that Eli Wiesel writes on September 4th, 1959. One background information. There was a man named Felix Kerstin, Edward Alexander Felix Kerstin, September 30th, 1898 to April 16th, 1960, was the personal physician of Reichsführer Heinrich Himmler. He was also a confidant and advisor to him. In 1959, Eli Wiesel interviewed Felix Kerstin, the former therapist of Himmler, Yimach Shmoi. At this point, this is Eli Wiesel writing. At this point, our extremely lengthy discussion essentially came to a close. At the end of the conversation, I became very tired. Whenever I go back to those days and nights, I feel that part of me remained there. I arose and I extended my hand and thanked him. And then, for some reason, I suddenly remembered a question. By the way, did you ever hear of the name Rudolf Kastner? Oh, I was sure he would answer negatively, and I was already prepared to explain to him everything behind the name. When to my total surprise, he replied, "Of course I did." "Well, when?" I asked. "Now? Post-war? Yes, post-war. I heard he had some problem in Israel." It seems that he doesn't know Kastner's dead. Excuse me, Mr. Kirsten. You said you also heard of him post-war? Should I conclude that you heard his name during the war? Yes, I heard his name then as well. From whom? From General Walter Schellenberg and General Rudolf Brandt. The first was head of Himmler's Sonderkommando, counterintelligence, and the second was the Reichsführer's secretary and adjunct. What did they say about him? Schellenberg said to me that Kastner was one of his agents and that he did a good job in Budapest. He also told me that Kastner asked him to release a few hundred Jews from the camp because he wanted to prepare an alibi for himself. In the espionage services, it's common practice to provide assistance to your agents because often one might require their services after the deluge. Are you sure that Schellenberg was talking about Dr. Rudolf Kastner? Yes, I'm absolutely sure. And what did Rudolf Brandt tell you? Oh, once he told me laughing that in Budapest there's this Jewish agent in the service of our Nazi intelligence who has a similar name like my name. The physical therapist's name is Kirsten, who has a similar name like my name, Kastner, Kirsten. Did Himmler ever mention Kastner? I don't remember. But once when I complained about the brutal Nazi methods against the Jews, he told me that he had some Jews working for him for money in Switzerland and other countries. It was then, says Eli Wiesel, I told him that Kastner was murdered in Tel Aviv. Really, Kirsten said. Wow, I didn't know that. I'm not here to judge. Kastner was assassinated, and he was killed, and it should never be said that, God forbid, that I condone or in any way support or applaud the death of a man without due process. Obviously, resorting to mob violence or vengeance is not our way. Although obviously I can explain, I can understand, and perhaps certainly sympathize with the feelings of those. People talk about the train and the 1,600 that Eichmann agreed to free. And Kastner had 378 of his own Kloisenbergers on it. Plus, like I said, other people were involved as well, the Satmarov, etc. But even on the train, it wasn't so simple. A man named Erwin Schaefer, who's still alive, at least he was in 2006, when he was asked about Kastner, he said, "My parents were thrown off the Kastner train, even though they bought their tickets with their own money. Kastner oversold the train. In the end, he had more people than tickets. So when the train was about to pull out of the station, he sent a couple of his German goons down the length of the train to remove some passengers. When my father showed him his ticket, he ripped it up. The goon didn't even look at it. He accused my father with traveling without false papers, claiming he hadn't bought the tickets. And then they frog-marked my parents off, threw them out of the doors, and they eventually ended up being gassed in Auschwitz." Obviously, we have thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that train went out with 1,600 people. To the best of my knowledge, there is no Orthodox or famous Orthodox person, certainly not the Satmarov, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, certainly not Rabbi Yonasan Shteif, Zecher Tzadik Livrocha, not the Baruch, Reb Michal Ber Weissmandel, who was also saved by him, not on the train. I've searched in all their biographies and all the works on them and by them, and there's never a good word, practically there's never any word, there's never a good word of mention for him at all. The Satmar you may disagree with him in his political outlooks. You could disagree with him or agree with other Rabbonim with regard to how one views the state of Israel. But there's nobody in the world who argues that the Satmarov was second to none in Chesed. The fact that all over the New York City area, a Jew of any stripe, I still remember how my father-in-law, what justice I thought it was. My father-in-law, Zecharna L'Vracha, when he was in the hospital in Cornell, I remember him telling me about the Satmar Bikr Chola women who would bring homemade food. A Jew in a knitted yarmulke or a Jew without a yarmulke. There's no doubt in my mind the Satmar Rav, with his golden midos, certainly would never violate the ultimate mitzvah of Hakaras HaTov, and Rabbi Yonasan Shteif as well. Pasuk tells us in Shmos, Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Gimel, Parshas Bo, Gama ish Moshe Gadol Ma'od Be'eretz Mitzrayim Be'enei Avdei Paro Uve'enei Ha'am. And the man Moshe is great, very great in the land of Egypt, in the eyes of the servants of Paro and in the eyes of the Jewish people. There was a man who used to live here in town. Many of you remember him, Dr. Leff, Zicharno Livrocha. He lived on Howard Avenue, Dr. Leff. He himself told me a beautiful shot on this pasuk. I'll never forget it. I say it over often. He learned this pasuk, and the man Moshe was great in the land of Egypt, be'enei avdei Paro, in the eyes of the servants of Paro. And because of that, he was also great be'enei ha'am. Once he was the goyim, liked him. Oh, now the people liked him. I don't believe Dr. Kastner, who grew up in a house of Torah and mitzvahs, even though, and I don't judge him for his abandoning his Torah mitzvahs, chas v'shalom. That certainly I have no business in. He knew Torah, he knew mitzvahs, he knew chesed, and I don't doubt, frankly, that he helped a lot of people up until 1944, and I have no doubt. And I have no reason to believe or doubt, notwithstanding his somewhat personality which was filled with hubris and perhaps condescending to other human beings, arrogance. Nevertheless, that's a far cry from being evil. But I do believe that there's a difference when you start to meet people and you're in situations where you feel there are people bigger than you there, even non-Jewish people there, that a person could get caught up in their own self-aggrandizement, self-greatness. The only thing we're allowed to learn in the Gemara, one of the only things, is the story of Kamsa bar Kamsa. In the story of Kamsa bar Kamsa, we learn that a certain man who had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Kamsa made a banquet. He told the servant, "Go invite my friend Kamsa." The servant went and mistakenly invited Bar Kamsa. When the host came and found Bar Kamsa sitting there, he said, "This man is my enemy. What are you doing here? Get up and leave right now." Bar Kamsa says, "Since I have already come, please do not embarrass me. Let me stay, and I will pay the cost of what I eat and drink." No! Bar Kamsa pleaded, "I will pay for the cost of your entire banquet." No! And he grabbed Bar Kamsa by the hand, pulled him from his seat, threw him out. Bar Kamsa said to himself, since the rabbis were seated at the banquet and did not protest, evidently what he did was acceptable to them, I will go slander them in the royal palace. That's a courtesy of the article translation. The beginning of that story tells us, or a little later on actually in that story, the Gemara tells us that there was a dispute among the rabbis when he tried to bring a korban. And the Gemara says, "An v'sanusal she'Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus, hechrives beisedu." Rabbi Yochanan, the tolerance displayed by Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulus in refusing to have Bar Kamsa put to death destroyed our temple. And very beautiful here, but they just sent this to me. Tisha, I didn't even order it. I used it. They write in the commentary, very beautiful. The commentary they write that unfortunately that Bar Kamsa, that obviously he was wrong. Rabbi Tav, he writes, the Gemara elsewhere implies that the sin of flattery, i.e., indicating approval or even tacitly condoning the misdeed of an influential person in his presence in order to curry favor with him, was the sin of Reb Zechariah ben Avkulus. Meaning what? Before I gave this speech, I spoke to other Rabbanim. I spoke to people in the know. I spoke to a number of college professors. I spoke to Dr. Rafi Madoff, a well-known scholar of the Holocaust. I spoke to Professor Schneier Zalman Lyman, a scholar of a scholar, and he alerted me to a variant text in the story of Bar Kamta. The story is basically identical, that a man invited a man named Kamta to he wanted Kamta to come, but instead Bar Kamta came. And the same altercation occurred, where the man insisted that Bar Kamta, his enemy, be kicked out, be removed from the party. However, there's one very important change that Rabbi Schneier Lyman alerted me to. And that is that in the version in the Eicha Rabasi, in the story which appears in the Eicha Rabasi, as opposed to in our Gemara, the way that we have it, the way in our Talmud it is, in the general, since the rabbis, Havu Yasfe Rabbanan V'lo Michu, the rabbis were there, and then there's a different story where Zechariah ben Avkulus and a korban. But the way the story appears in the Eicha Rabasi is Amrle Ana Yahiv Debei Kol Hadin Sudasa. Bar Kamsa said, I'll pay for the whole meal. The whole meal. Amrle Kum Lech. Get out. V'haya Sham Reb Zechariah ben Avkulus. V'haisa Sipek Biyado Libchos. V'lo Micha. In the version of the Eicha Rabasi, Reb Zechariah ben Avkulus was present. Nothing to do with the korban later. Should we bring it, not bring it in, as a movement, as a defect. Reb Zechariah ben Avkulus was the man who was there. Vayasipek biyado libchos. He had the idea to take a stand. He could have taken a stand. He could have spoken up. He could have said, no, this is wrong. V'lo micha. And he remained silent. Miyad nofik. At that point, the man was thrown out of the party. And he said, Ana echo kurtzoin. I'm going to tell on the Jews, to the Roman government, and the rest, of course, is the reason we're sitting here today fasting for 25 hours. I don't know the true story of Dr. Kastner. Obviously, I presented a version based on my hours and hours and hours of research seemed to be the correct one. But either way, number one, this has no bearing whatsoever on the beauty and the chesed of Hashem of those who survived. And the fact that people talk about all the thousands of survivors of the Kastner transport, frankly, is true, but that doesn't, if he had nothing really to do with it, if it was a compromise to save his soul, it doesn't make him a hero, and it doesn't, frankly, demonize them either. Obviously, they went on the transport. Why wouldn't they? They paid, or they had someone pay for them. Why not? And the fact that people say there are thousands of survivors because they were one group. Imagine there are thousands of survivors of people from Auschwitz, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen as well, but they were individuals. But the fact that I celebrate and I'm thankful for Hashem, like I said, my wife herself descends from a Kastner survivor, a transport survivor, the train. That doesn't in any one iota minimize my thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the Yeshua still he granted that people were saved. But it also doesn't maximize one iota a feeling of admiration if what was done in a way, as in the words of Judge Halevi, was selling one's soul to the devil. How would you feel If a terrorist, God forbid, was going to tell me they're going to come into this room and kill everyone in the room. However, if you agree, Rabbi Eisenman, to be quiet, you be quiet. Let me come in with my AK-14 and shoot up the room. Let me come and shoot up the room. If you agree not to warn everyone and to keep everyone quiet, there are rumors around that a terrorist might come. There are rumors. But you tell them nothing to worry about. Show them postcards from Wonderville, Virginia. I'll save the 4 people here. You can have these 4 people. I can still love those 4 people. But it doesn't make me a savior. It still makes me a collaborator. It's hard sometimes, but sometimes we have to speak up. It's hard sometimes, but sometimes we have to say what's uncomfortable. It's hard sometimes, and we have to say, no. I'm going to say what's going to happen. I'm not going to sacrifice everyone. I'm not going to be held captive, which is very plausible in what occurred. With Hashem's help, we should never be in such situations. But nevertheless, in whatever situations we do find ourselves, which hopefully will never be, in the severity and the magnitude of the decisions which had to be made during the Holocaust, but even smaller decisions when we have a choice to either speak up and speak up for the truth, and speak up to protect others who perhaps are relying on us for protection, we should remember that. Because that's also a form of Ahavas Chinam. I'm going to conclude with my own little vort. All the Mefarshim say, what's Siddur Chinam, Ahavas Chinam? So they say Siddur Chinam is baseless hatred. What's Ahavas Chinam? Baseless love? What, I love you for no reason? To hate someone for no reason, I can hear. What's to love someone for no reason? So perhaps I was thinking similar to the idea of when we bury someone, we call it a chesed shalemes. There's no expectation. It's a chesed with no expectation of any sort of reward, of any sort of payback, of any sort of remuneration. So too, when you stand up for someone, and even if you place yourself in danger, and you stand up for someone when it's not popular, and you stand up for something because it's right, even though you may lose your whole position and who knows what tomorrow will bring, that's Ava, which is Chinam, it's free. There's no remuneration that there's going to be expected or coming. With Hashem's help, we should never have such stories. We should only have stories, Bez Hashem, of where we're able to do chesed, and Bez Hashem, when faced with difficult situations, the Kadosh Baruch Hu should give us the strength, the ability, the insight to be able to persevere and to truly show Ahavas Chinam. Bez Hashem should be the last marking of Tisha B'Av we go through. Thank you.